Welcome back to the Tuesday, June 11, Lane County Board of Commissioners meeting. We've done everything up till item 8A, which is county administration announcements. And then we have executive session, other business, and recess. And now we're at 12A. We'll go back, circle back, get those other things later. So we're at 12A, which is second reading and public hearing on ordinance 1903 in the matter of amending Lane Code 14.080 appeals and 14.090 limitations on approved and denied applications to make corrections required by the Land Use Board of Appeals, remand of ordinance 18-02, LUBA number 2018-093, amending Lane Code Chapter 14 to make minor clarifications and corrections, and adopting a savings and severability clause. File number 509-PA-19-05317. And with us to discuss this matter is Amber Bell, Interim Planning Supervisor. Is Landwatch Lane County part of this?
We've not received testimony from them to date, though I believe that we have a representative in the.
All right. I usually have been making my disclosure, and I didn't know if that was needed in this case.
I should also say that they were the appellant.
Okay.
Appeal to LUBA.
Okay, so I just mentioned that one of the lawyers that sometimes represents Landwatch is a lawyer in Eugene named Sean Malone, and as I've previously put on the record, I've had a concern about whether or not I need to make a disclosure or not, and Mr. Clark and I have discussed this, and I believe my disclosure is sufficient to say that he and I will occasionally work on litigation together in our law firms, but not ever discuss matters pertaining to his representation of Landwatch. So is that sufficient, Mr. Clark? Okay. And then I think we're ready then to have Ms. Bell introduce this matter.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd be happy to provide the staff report at this time or after the opening of hearing and explanation of the purpose and rules of the hearing.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to read the entire script now?
If you'd like, 2 through 6, or I could provide the staff report and then.
Okay, so I'll just go down the list of items for the,
Before we get started too much in the process of this, I may be asking just to move the reading and reset the public hearing on this based on the answer to legal counsel and the staff of this question. House Bill 2106 has passed both the Senate and the House. That specifically allows for up to 5 additional one-year extensions of land use permits for residential development. I think I was trying to look at the measure of history, what day that actually happened. I think that it actually was just today, 59-1. So it's waiting the governor's signature. It would drastically change these amendments, I believe, or need a significant change to these amendments to Chapter 14 related to extensions of land use permits. Is it wise for us to continue through a public hearing and adopting these when that's going to require us to immediately turn right around and fix? That's, I mean, and it's not like it might happen now. It's like, it was 26-3 in the Senate and 59-1 in the House. I doubt the governor's not going to sign the bill. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Bozovich. Based on your question at the first reading, we have been tracking House Bill 2106, and we understand it went to the House today and is likely to go to the governor for signature very soon. There's a couple of ways that we could incorporate those amendments in Lane Code Chapter 14. We're anticipating bringing back additional Lane Code Chapter 14 amendments, likely in July, to address some of the board's suggestions around the appeal process and changing the elect whether or not to hear procedures, we could address the additional timeline extension revisions at that time. Or if the board opened the hearing today, the hearing could be continued to a subsequent date certain.
Okay, I would urge the board to continue this item past today, because I believe if we amend 14 to change the renewal reissue of permits and then go back to what 2106 says, there's going to be this period where we'll have that we weren't allowing renewals. And then we're going to see a bunch of appeals of previous renewals because of that interim mismatch. And I think it's better that we just deal with that once, because I think that will open a whole can of worms to have a 1 or 2 month period where we're not allowing one-year renewals and basically saying we shouldn't have been allowing those, because that's the basis of this remand, to now allowing at least 5, according to the new bill that was put in specifically to correct this issue. So I don't mind if we hold the hearing today. I would just ask the board to seriously consider that we continue this far enough along that we can do all the changes at once, rather than have a period of having one code and going back. And then that opens a question of, does that suddenly make all those previous renewals void, which I think would be a huge issue for us.
Good. My idea was that we march down the protocol for holding the second reading and public hearing, hold the public hearing, and then roll this to a date forward when it'll be clearer what the state law is, when the governor has signed the legislation, if that's what she does, and then we'll have a date certain to come back on this. Go ahead, Mr. Clark.
Yeah, for my purposes, I think that makes sense. At very least, I think you should open the hearing and continue the hearing if there's concern with the board about receiving evidence pertaining, for example, to the House bill. But at very least, I think you should open the hearing. Whether you continue it or close it is the board's desire.
So, okay, so I will march down the procedural rules for the Board of Commissioners public hearing. We have now read the agenda item and agenda title. We've explained the purpose of the, well, we're about to explain the purpose and rules for this hearing. The proposed Lane County Lane Code amendments are subject to the applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 12.005, 12.050, and 16.252, parenthesis 2. And the hearing date today is June 11, 2019. The order of proceedings for this hearing will be first the report by staff, followed by public testimony, then additional comments by staff. Testimony must be directed toward the approval criteria and criteria believed to be applied to the decision. Failure to raise an issue with sufficient specificity to enable a response may preclude appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals on that issue. Prior to the conclusion of the public hearing, any participant may request the record be left open to provide opportunity for additional written evidence or arguments regarding the application. Following a public hearing on this matter, the board may make a decision. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. At this time, I will call for disclosure of Board of Commissioner abstentions due to conflicts of interest or biases. Do any commissioners have a disclosure they wish to make? Seeing none, I will just remind people that I made a disclosure earlier, and it won't be a conflict of interest or bias that'll require me to abstain from participating. The audience is now allowed to challenge any commissioner's qualifications to hear the matter. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to challenge the board's qualifications? Seeing none, I am now opening the public hearing. And after I open the public hearing, we'll hear the report by staff. report by staff, then we'll have the public hearing.
Thank you, Chair. As you may recall, the board approved ordinance 1802, the Code Modernization of Lane Code, Chapter 14, last year on July 10th, 2018. Subsequently, that was appealed to Land Use Board of Appeals, and it has been remanded based on 2 issues. The first basis of remand concerns appeal requirements at Lane Code 14080. The appellant, Tuluba, asserted that Lane Code 14080 appeal submittal requirements are not consistent with state law because they require appellants to specify appeal issues as a jurisdictional requirement, or in other words, a jurisdictional requirement is one where the county can require the appeal submittal requirement as a prerequisite to obtain a hearing. Per ORS 215-416, an initial decision may be rendered by the planning director without a hearing, subject to mailing of notice of decision and an opportunity for request for an initial de novo evidentiary hearing. The applicant and other parties shall have the same opportunity to present testimony, arguments, and evidence, and the presentation of testimony, arguments, and evidence shall not be limited to issues raised in a notice of appeal. That's paraphrasing state law. Lane Code 14080 includes a jurisdictional appeal requirement that notice of appeals explain appeal issues in writing with sufficient specificity and then list 1 or more reasons of appeal. And there's a list of different appeal reasons that an appellant can identify. And LUBA found that these are not requirements of state law and that the statutory rights to obtain an evidentiary de novo hearing and raise potentially unlimited issues at that hearing is undermined if an appeal can be rejected at the onset due to a subjective assessment by the county of how well the appeal requirements have been addressed. In general, LUBA concluded that the county can require that an appeal explain issues with sufficient specificity and detailed reasons of appeal, but they can't be jurisdictional requirements for a notice of appeal. And so to address this, the proposed amendments that are before you clarify that these 2 requirements will be requested as components of notice of appeal, but they won't be jurisdictional appeal requirements that can be a basis for appeal rejection. And we've reorganized the section a bit to move the requirements that were listed under 14080-1C, small Roman numeral 6 and 7 under 14080-1D. And then the second base for remand concerns additional 1-year timeline extensions for resource dwellings outside of urban growth boundaries. Ordinance 1802 includes timeline extensions, procedures, and provisions that include an allowance that additional 1-year timeline extensions beyond the initial extension will be authorized, provided that the applicable criteria for the decision have not changed. The appellant challenged in their appeal of Ordinance 1802 that Chapter 14 impermissibly allows unlimited successive 1-year timeline extensions of permits for residential development on resource land in violation of ORS 215-417 and its implementing Oregon Administrative Rule. LUBA upheld that assignment of error, noting that state law and the rule use the word extension in the singular. And to address this, we've clarified in the proposed amendments that the additional 1-year timeline extensions for resource dwellings are not allowed, and only a single extension of the permit may be issued for a maximum period of 2 years for residential development on agricultural or forest land outside of an urban growth boundary. Of course, if signed by the governor, House Bill 2106 allows some additional provisions for 1-year timeline extensions. My understanding is that it would allow the county to allow additional 1-year timeline extensions up to 5 years. And we can certainly look into incorporating that if the hearing is held, is continued today at the board's direction or in a subsequent Chapter 14 amendment. There's some other minor amendments that are proposed as part of Ordinance 1903 that's before you. Those are based on recent hearings, official proceedings, and additional legal review. Namely, there's amendments proposed to Lane Code 14060 and 14100 that would extend the requirement from 10 to 20 days for mailing of notice of a LUBA remand hearing. And that would be consistent with ORIS Chapter 197, which requires mailing of hearing notice 20 days in advance of a first evidentiary hearing. Upon further review of case law, we found that that also applies to LUBA remand hearings. And that concludes my staff report at this time.
Okay, so at this time, we'll move to the public hearing phase, and of course, commissioners will have an opportunity to ask questions of staff at the conclusion of the public hearing. So I've opened the public hearing. At this time, I'm going to call for testimony of persons in favor of this matter. Are there any persons who wish to testify in favor of this matter? No. Is there testimony from other persons? Yes. We have the envelope. Okay. Ms. Siegel is here. Welcome, Ms. Siegel.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
I wouldn't characterize being for or against.
Your testimony is under other persons.
So I'm here for Landwatch Lane County at Post Office Box 5347. I wouldn't characterize our position as for or against necessarily. We just wanted to remind staff about Multnomah v. Multnomah, the case where LUBA decided in 2003 that a county can't sue itself. I'm paraphrasing. That was the only reason that we came here today, and that's really our only comment. And it's in more context here, so if staff wishes to have the board review a decision that's adjudicated by the hearing official, that would essentially, I don't think staff would then want to pursue that further to LUBA. So there is that distinction. Multnomah went all the way to LUBA. This would be just hearing official to the board. I'm not really sure from the current proposal what would happen next, like who would write the findings if the board were to reverse a hearing official decision requested on review. It's not quite clear to me. Maybe it is to staff, and you might ask questions about that to see, since I can't speak to it. And I did want to say about the additional 5-year extension, it's not fixing a project, with due respect, Commissioner Bozevich. There's not, fixing a problem. There is no problem. The law reads that these dwelling permits, they used to be good for 2 years plus 1 additional year, and that was changed to 4 years plus an additional 2, so it was doubled. And now, essentially, they want to add 5 additional 1 year, so these permits would be good for almost 12 years, so doubling again almost. And I've tried to think of an analogy of what else that we get are good for 12 years without review. I have not even a driver's license. You even have to, is good for that without review. You have to take a driving test every 10 years, I think. The problem in Lane County with these multiple extensions is that a lot of these approvals that have been extended already multiple times, some of these are from the 90s, many of them are from the early to mid-2000s. Staff has taken a different approach recently and required these things that have beyond the extension period because the hearing official has agreed, as has LUBA, to, there's an option called a reissue. I'm not sure if it's still on the books, but at least for a period, these multiple extensions were allowed to, instead of doing the multiple extension again, do a reissue where staff would review the application again for a reduced fee. The biggest problem is that in the early days, before we had the current staff and the current planning director and the current manager, there were a lot of shortcuts taken in the review and decision-making on these dwellings in the forest zone. A lot of those had to do with the siting standards for fire, safety, and design. So even if you're okay with subdivision-like configurations with dwellings close together on small lots, I don't think you should be okay with the substandard fuel breaks. primary and secondary. And when you look at a lot of the old site plans and no fuel breaks shown at all, and these were approved, and if these things go forward as additional one-year extensions, it's a problem for the county in terms of public safety. And remember, these are property tax deferred units of land, and I don't think we talk about the property tax deferral at all. And it's not necessarily always being applied where it should be. And I could give you examples where it's not. And because of that, the districts themselves, the fire districts and the county services themselves are accommodated for financially because of these loopholes in the deferral. So I just wanted to say in closing that the county can be more restrictive than state law. You don't necessarily have to allow an additional five one-year extensions if that's what the governor assigns. You could limit it to 2. You could have other provisions that say if there's already been so many extensions, it would be limited. You're not required to be as strict as state law. You're just required to not be weaker than the law. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other persons that wish to testify? Seeing none, we'll now turn to additional comments by staff.
Staff have no additional comments at this time, but we're happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Okay, now, are we closing the hearing or are we continuing the hearing? Either way, it requires a motion. Okay, so I'll turn to the board. Do we want to have the questions to staff before we decide to close the hearing or after? What's the best way to do that, Mr. Clark? Before?
I guess it makes sense to me to leave that question in abeyance until the board has asked some questions.
Okay.
Perhaps if they
All right.
pertain to whether or not to leave it open.
So, Ms. Bell, big picture, the county adopted these code provisions. It was appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and the Land Use Board of Appeals then made a decision and to remand it back to the Board of Commissioners. And that's where we are.
That's correct.
And some of what's been discussed is subject to possible state law change that's imminent, we think. Okay. These extensions that are being granted, these one-year extensions, multiple one-year extensions, that apparently was the subject of the decision, but it's also the subject of the legislation. Is that all accurate? Okay. So
One of the assignments of error, not
one of the assignments of error, okay. And so, as I'm hearing it, one thing that might be done here is to continue the public hearing at a date and time certain beyond the time when the governor has to make a decision about to sign or veto the legislation. Is that estimated to be 1 month?
I don't know. I suppose Mr. Kyler would be best to speak to what he knows about where they are in the legislative
Well, we're
session.
about ready to leave the legislative world and enter the law world, right?
Yes,
Exactly. When the sausage making is done, then we're out of the law.
I do think it makes some sense to continue the hearing rather than close it.
Okay.
The possibility of allowing folks to testify as to,
The change.
and what that law really means. It's frankly
Okay.
not clear to me reading it now whether
Yeah.
it mandates that the county
Okay.
allow this as extensions or simply allows the county to do it.
Or it allows the county, if it wishes, to have these multiple extensions over time. Okay.
Right. This, if I could bore you a little more, the terminology used in the House bill is may, that the county may allow, but frankly, that's the same word that's used in the statute that allows farm uses. The county may allow certain farm uses, and it lists them. The county has no discretion about those, notwithstanding the use of the word may.
Okay.
And that's in 215, 261, or 231. So what that word may means is, at issue, I suppose.
Okay. You've got your calendar out as far as when you think the governor decision will be made?
Our understanding, coordinating with Alex Kyler, is that it's likely to go to the governor this month. So it could be very soon. And it looks like the engrossed language lists this as a emergency House bill. So it
Okay.
could go into effect upon passage.
So there's no need for a conference committee. The House bill and the Senate bill are the same.
That's, the last vote was the reconcile.
Okay. So does the governor have 30 days from the date of passage?
I'm not.
I don't remember. That sounds right, and frankly, I think there's more experience with the legislature up there than here.
Okay, so why don't you propose a date out?
Staff would propose July 9th,
Okay,
and if the board moves third reading.
that's not a month away.
I believe June 25th is a down week,
That's our first up
so that would
week in
put us
July.
out July 9th.
But July 9th isn't 30 days from the time of the approval, because if the approval was just today,
We could do it the 23rd or the 30th.
yeah, okay. Okay, other questions from staff?
So
Go ahead.
I just want to address a couple things. One, as we grant these dwellings in these resource zones, we are allowing people to exercise a property right. And one of the reasons why I never had an issue with the extensions is I don't feel like a right has a time clock on it. Once you've established you have that right, you should always have that right. So just, now at least the legislature's defined that really only has a 5-year additional extension. That's up to the legislature to define. Rights have time limits, But I will also note wildland fire assessments, which I pay out in my property. I pay the minimum $65 a year because I'm out in what's considered property capable of carrying a wildfire, that go through to ODF for their firefighting are not subject to deferral. All ag property, forest property that may be in forest deferral still pays a wildland fire assessment. Secondary to that, assessments for properties that are in deferral like that quite often have a description around the actual homestead and then the rest of the property as far as fire districts go. I know several people who actually have 2 parcels for assessment on their land, but only 1 parcel of land. So, if you want to understand what's deferred and who's paying for fire service or not, I suggest we bring the Mike Cole's in here to explain that a little bit better than I could. But these dwelling units are not exempt from paying for their fire protection. I just want to try and make that clear, that there's no deferral of the wildland fire assessment, which once you get over 2 acres is based on a per acre cost. $65 is the minimum, and I'm only 1.3 acres, so that's why I'm paying the $65. And then the fire assessments for fire districts, they actually will assess just the homestead area for the fire district assessment, and not the rest of the property doesn't get assessed that because it's not protected by the fire district. Only the structures are protected by the fire district.
I have a question about these farm deferrals and forest land treatment in tax law, property tax law, and its relationship to land use law. It's always bothered me that owners of forest land or farmland can come in and say, we've been getting this deferral because this is agricultural land and we're using it for agricultural purposes, but now we want to put houses on it and it's just completely not suitable at all for agricultural production. And they bring in experts to say, this isn't agricultural land, yet they've been receiving this deferral for agricultural land. what can we do to try to plug that loophole? If you've been saying it's agricultural land for all these years, to get out of paying for schools and community college and county government and other things that people outside of cities have to pay, and then you can turn around and say, oh, that was just for tax purposes, not really. Well, really, it was no good, but we wanted it for the property tax purposes, so we didn't have to pay for the schools. And what can we do to plug that loophole?
I hear the question. I can't speak to tax deferrals. That is under a different section of state law that addresses special assessments and their criteria.
I know,
for
but
those
what can we say,
assessments.
if you ask for this deferral, then you have just said how the land is being characterized and how it's being used. Can you do that in your land use rule? I'm not asking you to change the tax law.
Chair Sorensen, Commissioners, I mean, it's certainly possible to try to modify the special use permit process for these dwellings to put in a provision that says if this property was, previously in tax deferral for farm or forestry uses, X, Y, or Z happens, you have more difficult criteria to go through. I would caution, again, that's a pretty clear potential taking of a development, right, that's currently allowed under state law, and that could be a potential Measure 37, Measure 49 claim, so that's the big concern there.
Okay. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Just for a little bit more clarity, the deferrals for farm ag, it is a separate section of law, but in order to get a dwelling on a piece of ag property, you have to show a minimum level of income. So you're actually showing that it is productive land to get a dwelling. It's not like we're saying it's not. Now, when you talk about moving something from forest to marginal land, then you're talking, or ag to marginal land, or to rezone, then you're talking about proving it's not productive. That might be a different case, but still the standards for tax deferrals have very little to do with land use. It's property tax law versus land use law, and they're not really well intertwined. I agree, but we don't have people come in and say it's bad ag property, we want to put a house on it. Usually they have to tell us that they're making a minimum amount of money to qualify to put a house on it. It's actually the opposite. And making that money as an ag, through agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a date in the future for continuing the public hearing. And what date are you recommending?
July 9th is available, though that wouldn't necessarily accommodate a full 30 days for us to.
Right.
July 23rd as well as an
July
option.
23rd is, we believe, beyond the time it'll take the legislature to get the bill approved and sent to the governor, which could occur in the next, say, week. And then, let's say, a 4-week period begins after that. So this is about 5 weeks down the road.
I
Okay.
would anticipate that would give us enough.
Yeah, and there is an emergency clause, so there's no potential for a vote of the people.
So I would like to move approval of the second reading and continuing the public hearing on ordinance number 1903 to a third reading and continued public hearing on July 9th, 2019 at 1:30 time certain.
July 9th or July 23rd?
I thought we said 9th, but
July 9 is a little sooner than the period.
Okay,
July
sorry.
23 is a
I will
little
amend,
later.
I'll restate my motion of approving the second reading, continuing the public hearing on ordinance 1903, and setting the third reading and continued public hearing for July 23rd, 2019 at a 1:30 time certain.
Second.
Okay, it's moved and seconded to move the third reading and public hearing on ordinance 1903 to July 23 at 1:30 PM. All right, and you guys have checked, the board meeting is that day? Yeah. Good, okay. Very good. All right, further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, we'll go to a vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries 5-0. All commissioners voting aye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks. Okay, back to the adjustments to the agenda for the rest of the day. We're going to be next moving to our floodplain matter, then our legislative update. Then we're going to either have the county administrator or the county council. The county council is prepared to give a discussion, a report on 3 cases dealing with the county's authority under the pesticide laws. Then we're going to move to county commissioner announcements and work sessions. Don't believe we have an executive session today. We do have a executive session tomorrow, and we have a 9 o'clock time certain tomorrow morning. So without further ado, then, we are ready for item 12B, discussion, floodplain regulations in Lane Code and potential floodplain code updates. Rachel Surslev, Lane County Land Management Division is here. Welcome to Ms. Surslev.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Rachel Surslev, planner in the Land Management Division, and I'm here to talk about floodplain regulations. This topic was last before you on March 19th of this year, and it was coupled with the fire siting standards, but due to the complexity of both of those issues, the board directed staff to separate the topics. So I'm back just going to talk on the floodplain regulations, the current code, and potential floodplain code updates. So just generally, I'm first going to go over current standards in Lane Code, and then I will go over some of the potential code updates that were discussed in the agenda cover memo. The current standards are located in Lane Code Chapter 16-244 and 10-271, and generally these codes regulate development in the floodplain to ensure that life and property is reasonably safe from flooding. The code regulates development in flood zones, and those flood zones are generally designated based on the risk of the flooding in those areas. And some of the most common flood zones that we see in the county are the A zone, the unnumbered A zone, and the AE zone. The difference in these designations, there are slight differences in how development is regulated in those zones. So in the A zone, it is an unstudied area, meaning we don't have BFE in that zone, so elevation requirements are slightly different than in other zones. Oh, I'm sorry, there will be lots of acronyms, but I'll try to not use them and explain what they are. So BFE is the base flood elevation, so that's how high the water will get in a 100-year flood, or a 1% chance of occurrence flood in every given year. And so in the AE zone, that is a studied area, so we do have the base flood elevation in that area. And given that information, we can regulate that zone a little bit differently than an unnumbered A zone. And for example, in Table 1, you can see an excerpt from our code. It's outlined that we have the type of the development and then the type of flood zone. And you can see that in an unnumbered A zone, we're elevating 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade. So we're measuring from the ground in that situation because we don't have BFE or base flood elevation. And then in other A zones where we do have the BFE, we're elevating 1 foot. So current standards, where do they come from generally? So Lane County is a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program, and the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, gets its minimum regulations from the Code of Federal Regulations, also known as CFR 44, as I will probably call it. And so that Code of Federal Regulations outlines the minimum standards, which are standards that Lane Code has adopted and that the county has adopted in order to be a NFIP participating community. Other places that our processes and standards come from is the community rating system. So we are a participating community of the community rating system. And this program grants points to a jurisdiction based on regulations or practices that go above and beyond the minimum requirements. And as a benefit to getting those points, you also get cuts on your insurance premiums for property owners that are within the participating community. So that is another area where our processes come from and stem from. And actually a few of the potential code updates that I'll go over today actually could gain more points for the CRS program if they were adopted. So now I'll cover a few of the potential code updates. These are things that the board either directed staff to research and present on, or throughout staff's research on code updates, these are also items that we may be recommending. The first topic is balance, cut, and fill. So this is something that the board requested more information on. Currently, Lane Code does not address the possible negative impacts of placing fill in the floodplain. One of those negative impacts can be an increase in flood levels due to the displacement of water when you're placing additional fill in a floodplain. And a possible solution to that is adopting a balanced cut and fill requirement, or also known as a compensation regulation. So essentially, someone who's coming in to place fill on their property would also have to cut, you could call it a mitigation area, or make a cut on the property in the same floodplain to compensate for the fill that's being placed on the property. And so that should compensate for the added fill within the floodplain and ensure that flood waters actually do not rise when you're adding additional materials to the floodplain. And I do have Oregon Statewide Planning Goal 7, Policy 5 up there because it does direct local governments to consider measures that exceed the NFIP. And one of the guidance sentences under that policy is limiting the placement of fill in the floodplain. Although this regulation wouldn't necessarily limit floodplain or fill in the floodplain, it would try to address the negative effects of that fill and the possible negative effects that it would have on increased flood levels. So another topic we're going to cover is cumulative calculation for substantial improvement. So substantial improvement are repairs, reconstruction, or addition to structures in the floodplain, which equal or exceed 50% of the market value. So when work is done to a structure in the floodplain and it meets that 50% threshold, the entire structure is required to be brought up to current floodplain code. And currently, staff does a substantial improvement analysis when someone comes in for building permits for a structure in the floodplain. But these, the improvement analysis is done each time a person comes in for a building permit, and we don't look at improvements to the structure over a period of time. So what we're suggesting here is to instead use a cumulative substantial improvement calculation, which would look at a certain period of time, and it would consider all of the improvements to the structure within that period of time to ensure that value is not being added to a structure in the floodplain without it being properly protected.
If I could just jump in for 1 second and kind of boil that down a little bit. Commonly, what we see is there will be a number of structures in the floodplain that were built before the floodplain regulations were put in effect, and they're below the base flood elevation, they're susceptible to flooding. Individuals will come in and want to improve those or put an addition on or something like that. And what we've seen over time is that people understand that if they go over that 50% threshold, they're required to elevate the house, which is obviously very expensive. So they'll do a minor addition 1 year, and then the next year they'll come in and do another addition and another. And so you'll get this pretty large development in the floodplain that now isn't built to the current standard. So that's the point of this cumulative improvement clause.
One other thing that I'd like to mention as an option to altering how we do substantial improvements could be to lower that threshold. So it's at 50% of the market value right now. But we could lower the threshold to either 30 or 40% or whatever the board would direct us to do, and ensuring that an improvement would meet that threshold sooner and thus have to be constructed to the current floodplain regulations sooner. And so now I'll discuss a little bit about limiting floodway development. So the floodway, and I'll explain a little bit about what the floodway is and how our code addresses it. So the floodway is the area adjacent to a stream channel that is needed to discharge floodwaters during an event. And this area can have pretty high velocity floodwaters. It can carry projectiles and debris. It can also have some pretty extreme erosion due to the velocity of those floodwaters. The floodway also provides a mechanism for limiting development. So currently in lane code, if you wanted to develop in the floodway, you would, it is prohibited unless you can provide some evidence that there will not be a rise in floodwaters due to the encroachment or the development. And how we confirm that is through an engineer's analysis. An applicant would hire an engineer to do a step backwater analysis on the property, which is essentially looking at floodwaters and considering the encroachment and ensuring that that encroachment will not actually result in increases in the floodwaters, which might have negative impacts on downstream properties if those floodwaters did increase. So that is the process currently in place for developing within the floodway. What staff has explored here is actually further limiting development in the floodway due to the hazardous nature of that area. And due to the possible contention of this type of regulation, it doesn't necessarily have to be as stringent as no development in the floodway. There could be provisions and language that allow for replacement dwellings and grandfathering in of dwellings or structures in the floodway. Additionally, if properties are fully in the floodway, we could have language that speaks to still allowing those structures because the property is fully floodway, but maybe placing them further away from the stream channel or having some language that still allows them to develop the property, even if it is fully floodway. So next we have increasing freeboard. Freeboard is the elevation above the base flood elevation. So as I was saying earlier, we have a requirement to elevate structures in the AE zone 1 foot above base flood elevation, and freeboard is another way of talking about that 1 foot area. And what we would be recommending here is increasing the amount of freeboard required for elevating structures. This is the easiest way to reduce structural damage to a dwelling or a structure during flood events. And some of the immediate benefits would be lower insurance premiums. So I have a general example demonstrating how much discount there would be in a flood insurance premium with an increase in freeboard for a structure or a dwelling. So that would be one of the immediate benefits. Also less structural damage, obviously, during a flood event. It would ensure that a structure would be less likely to be damage during a flood event. However, a negative would be a higher upfront cost to building that structure or dwelling. Obviously, the property owner would have to invest a significant amount of money in order to elevate the structure if the requirement was higher, somewhere maybe around 2 feet or 3 feet of elevation. However, I'd like to point out that the money spent to elevate the structure would likely be gotten back down the line. If there was a flood, there would be less structural damage, and the property owner would spend less money repairing their dwelling and replacing their damaged property. So there could be some long-term benefits in that one. This one is pretty straightforward. We're looking at critical facilities in the floodplain. Generally, we're defining critical facilities as things like schools, hospitals, emergency facilities. And the idea behind this topic is to ensure that they are more protected during a flood event due to their necessity. And actually, this came out of the Oregon Model Floodplain Ordinance, which suggests that critical facilities be obviously located out of the floodplain area where possible, or if they are located in the floodplain, they be elevated to a higher level to the 500-year floodplain, or with 3 feet of freeboard, and then ensuring that there's adequate ingress and egress from the property and access to that facility. Small accessory structures is also something that we will want to address in code updates. And we would like to address the disconnect between the building code and the current floodplain code. So currently there's provisions in the building code that allow for size exempt structures, meaning a structure that is under 200 or 400 square feet is not required to get building permits, but they are still required to get floodplain permits and meet the floodplain regulations. And this can be quite costly. One of those requirements being elevation can be quite costly to do for a small accessory structure that's just going to be used for storage or access or parking or something like that. And so staff is suggesting to have a little bit more of connection between FEMA's guidance and the Oregon specialty code, which says that these structures can be wet flood proofed, but currently lane code floodplain regulations say that wet flood proofing is a variance, which is a costly process and timely, and usually property owners don't want to go through that process in order to wet flood proof their small accessory structure. So we're proposing to edit those provisions in order to make wet flood proofing for small accessory structures a little bit more accessible. And lastly, I wanted to mention our community assistant visit. And so this is a visit from FEMA representatives that provide technical assistance and review of NFIP participating communities. They review their floodplain process and floodplain regulations. And we actually just had this visit done last week. And so I wanted to bring up a few things that came up at that meeting. Generally, they thought our floodplain regulations met the minimum requirements of the NFIP. They did have some edits for us to make in terms of how our current code compares to the minimum requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations. So they are suggesting some edits in the language to make it more consistent with the CFRs. And that's all that I have for a presentation. Your next steps would really be to, you could direct staff to come back with more information on these topics, or direct us to move forward with some potential code amendments.
Okay, so do commissioners have comments? Commissioner Bozievich?
Thank you. And I used to be one of those engineers that did the studies for property owners to set flood elevations and do balance cut and fill in floodways, which is required right now. Floodplains is not. So as you talk about balance cut and fill, it's about whether we extend out into the floodplain. And I am fully in support of that, of amending our ordinance to have balance cut and fill. It's an important issue. One of the things we're seeing in the Midwest right now is the fact that we have actually cut off the floodplain from a lot of streams, and that storage availability upstream isn't there, and that's why we're seeing massive floods in some areas. It has very little to do sometimes with climate as to what we've done to our floodways and floodplains and our storage capabilities in those floodplains. So if you lose storage in the floodplain, it ought to be given back somewhere, because it's almost, yes, I could probably go through the calculations and show that it's less than the tenth of a foot or whatever that's allowable by FEMA impact as far as elevation rise to other properties. It's still not right. So I think I'm supportive of that. I'm supportive of the cumulative permit if you include inflation adjusting the original improvements, and as you go along, because one of the things you have is somebody does improvements, say over whatever the time period is that we decide is 5 years. The value of that home 5 years ago is significantly different than the value today. And the improvements that were done 4 years ago are different than the improvements today. So all that's going to have to be adjusted for each year and a calculation done on the adjusted basis of the original home and the adjusted basis of all the improvements to see if it meets the 50%. That's what I just want to make sure that we do dollars to dollars in the same year. Either we adjust back to the first year of the time period, or we adjust everything forward to the last year, just to make sure we're treating people fairly. Because if you start with the value 5 years ago of a property and do it against the improvements, particularly say if you did it today, and the way construction bids are coming in, it's pretty easy to exceed the 50% of my value of my property was 5 years ago after the 2008 recession. Yeah. So that's just want to be fair to property owners in that, but cumulative does make sense. We shouldn't let people ding us, annually for small pieces and then end up with larger than half their home in cumulative improvements. So I support that. The freeboard issue, one of the things, if you're building in floodway, it's a required 2 foot of freeboard. And in fact, I did a study for House on Sunderman shortly before the 96 floods, where we elevated the house to 2 feet above and did the balance cut and fill through there. And the water came up to exactly 2 feet below his floor during the flood, even though that was a, quote, 500-year storm for the Mohawk. Always good to have freeboard. But there is a difference between the need for freeboard in dam-protected areas like the Willamette floodway and unprotected like the Mohawk and the Siuslaw. And I think we need to recognize that, particularly when you talk about floodplain. My house in River Road that I had on Sunnyside Drive was flooded in the 40s and is in the floodway in the FEMA maps, in the floodplain, sorry, not floodway. But it has not been touched since, and even coming close to that since, because of the core dams and since they learned how to balance those projects. So back in the 40s, that whole area of River Road went underwater, but it hasn't been touched since the core projects have gone in. So do we have some kind of acknowledgement between protected zones versus unprotected watersheds for flood protection and freeboard requirements? So 1 foot in the Willamette is probably fine. 2 feet is probably more than enough at having done enough floodway calculations. Usually 1 foot will get you above the 500 year, 2 feet almost guarantees it. I think 3 feet's probably excessive. So, but I would think about maybe modifying that in the protected areas of the Willamette where they're downstream of these flood protection dams.
If I could just ask a clarifying question. My understanding is that when the new flood studies came in the 80s, they took into effect a lot of those dams and removed properties from the floodplain. So technically, those wouldn't require freeboard if they're mapped out of the floodplain. I know in the area I live in, at least it's probably, if the dams weren't there, it could flood, but it sounds like in River Road, maybe that wasn't the case.
Yeah, you look in between Santa Clara and Junction City, and there's a huge amount of land designated as floodplain that hasn't had floodwaters on it since the 40s. It's just, that's, FEMA, it's one of those things where they have to kind of consider that the dams aren't operating effectively. There's that's one of the things that goes along with their margins of safety in developing flood insurance. Because they're basically developing their maps for insurance purposes, not for actual flood. So but in our land use requirements, it'd be silly to require people to elevate 2 feet in that sort of imaginary floodplain. Technically, the Lane Event Center is in the floodplain. When's the last time the Lane Event Center flooded? So
It might be in the floodplain of the Amazon Creek, though.
it's still, when was the last time the actual event center flooded, the buildings? Just to give you an example of sometimes the conservative nature of flood maps. So just want to be careful that we're thinking about that as we develop those, thinking about protected versus unprotected watersheds. So my final comment, though, is there is a biological opinion out by the National Marine Fisheries folks that basically is, if implemented, which it kind of got sort of half started and pulled back, will have significant impact on any development in the floodplain. In fact, needing for mitigation for tree removal, all sorts of crazy things they were going to throw in there. Are we going to just kind of ignore that possibility for right now and finish this work? Or where are we with thinking about the BIOP?
I think we are kind of not ignoring the BIOP, but it seems like it's been put on hold again for at least another 3-4 years from what I've been told. And it's been over a decade since the lawsuit that started it all. So I think my recommendation would be to move forward.
Yeah, in this case, it's not quite like having a bill waiting to be signed by the governor. I think it's been set aside, and there's actually counter lawsuits on the recommended was it RPA. I can't remember what that's.
Reasonable and prudent alternatives.
Yeah, I was trying to remember what RPA stood for. Thank you. Too many acronyms when you get into this stuff. But the RPAs have got lawsuits already filed against them. If they were to be enacted, they'd probably be in the courts for 10 years also. So that's probably more important for us to act to protect the floodplains and floodways and help people protect themselves. That's part of what we're doing if we go with additional freeboard, is that's really about, maybe it's a little bit of upfront cost, but I think it's a prudent and reasonable for, up to 2 feet of freeboard. So that's my thoughts.
Okay, Commissioner Farr and then Commissioner Perney.
Thank you. And I'm not going to read from a prepared script. I'm going to say, though, I too am an engineer, and I have the badge from my uniform to prove it. Different kind of engineer, however. This is combat engineer. I first want to compliment you on a great presentation. Very entertaining, actually. It really was pretty entertaining.
Us engineers were thrilled.
And also us who have been affected by floodplains, one way or another. And to me, the most important thing is to make sure that everybody knows what they can and cannot do. If the rules are clear, then we should all be able to operate inside of the rules. We have an issue on county property, and I'm presuming that any changes that we make in our local regulations would apply to county property as well. And we have an empty building that's been empty for lots and lots and lots of years that could have been serving homelessness or county departments for all those years, but we've been thinking that it's in a floodplain, as the former National Guard Armory. And I'm not going to ask for a discussion about the National Guard Armory today, but the same question arises, when was the last time the National Guard Armory flooded? Including, several hundred-year floods in the last less than 100 years. So, but that being said, once again, we just need to have clear standards as to how we can improve our property. And for me, it's been a particular frustration, and I've shared it often with Mr. Mograhaisky and with others regarding how we have a big, dry, empty building not being used. And initially, the reason we didn't use it is because it was in the floodplain. And I think we were wrong, but I'm not sure we were wrong, because the rules seem to be a little bit vague regarding whether or not it is or isn't, or whether or not we can or cannot use it, or whether or not we can improve it. And if 50% of the existing value, what does that exactly mean on county property? So I'm looking forward to being able to move forward, not just for private citizens, but also for the county. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we had a testimony this morning from someone who I respect greatly, Tom Bowerman. And he suggested that we, in the meantime, place a moratorium on building or on issuing permits inside the floodway. So I'm just asking, maybe Mr. Clark is the person who could answer this, and it's an impromptu question that I don't know that you have all this in your memory banks to be able to answer, but what would it take to issue a moratorium on issuing new permits in the floodway until the regulations are solidified? And an adjunct question to that is, do we have any outstanding permits, or do we know what permits are hanging out there for development at this point in time? So 2 questions there.
I think Rachel has some numbers on how many floodplain development permits we typically get, and it sounds like we may have one pending, which is on appeal that I'm aware of, and that was one that Mr. Bowerman was involved with.
Okay, and since you mentioned that, one pending on appeal, there are a lot of floodways that aren't necessarily the major streams in our area. Commissioner Sorensen just mentioned the Amazon, which it runs adjacent inside of a concrete channel right now, adjacent to the event center. But we also have the Springfield, I think it's a mill race that runs behind the armory that probably produces its own floodplain. So we're talking about a lot of land that's not necessarily just on the Willamette River or one of the forks of Willamette or the Mackenzie River or the Long Tom. So anyway, back to you for my first question.
Short answer is I don't know. A lot of process normally would be involved with establishing a moratorium, and certainly hearings to hear from folks affected by it. I can't recall, I don't think I've been involved in it since we've been here, exactly what that entails, but wouldn't be easy or quick.
Okay, then, Mr. Chair, if I may just request, not an agenda team request, but could you just get a paragraph or 2 paragraphs together as to what that would take? It doesn't need to be in any great detail, just based upon what you can do in 5 or 10 minutes research, if that is possible. Just a general feeling for what it would take to issue a moratorium.
And if I can add something, to put it in perspective a little bit, we've had in the past 5 years, 15 floodway development permits that we've issued. And I think we only have one that's pending right now, to my knowledge. So I have those numbers for the past 5 years on floodway development permits.
And we can, if I asked, you could tell me the classification of each one of those, whether it's school, hospital, or private, or.
Yeah, I'd have to get back to you on the details of them.
All righty. And, we have a lot of property that are adjacent to rivers right now, and the city of Eugene is preparing to develop property. It's going to be interesting to see how all of this shakes down in the next year or 2 years. So, once again, thanks for a great presentation. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Okay, Commissioner Burney?
Well, fascinating, entertaining. I'll add very informative. Thank you very much. For me, because I'm not that informed, and I'm just being silly. You know that, Commissioner. I personally I would like to see, in my world, from my process, every potential policy and each one of their intent is to make people and property safe, to be fleshed out, and then to start with Commissioner Bozovich's and others' knowledge of these areas, to start fleshing it back, right? But I actually would like to see how safe we could make Lane County, at what cost, and then from there, discussion of what's reasonable and what's not, because I don't have that information. But I certainly like the intent behind each one of these potential policy areas.
If I could just clarify, are you suggesting you'd like to see the actual staff to develop draft language that would flesh this out?
As long as it's not a waste of staff time. I don't know what the process is to get from here to that point. But whatever it is, I just want to reiterate my appreciation for every single one of these as I've read and then listened and tried to evaluate. They all seem reasonable.
Hey, Commissioner Buck.
So I think this is especially pertinent, given that we had a flood not too long ago. And so in my district, I've heard about this issue quite a bit from a lot of different angles. So some are from just a safety point of view. For the most part, a lot of people live in these places, unless they were the original developer, they have no idea whether they're in the floodway or the floodplain. They're renting these homes. They bought a home that maybe they were informed that it was, maybe not. And so when we had a flood event like we've had, they have no idea, they didn't know whether they were in the zone to evacuate. So I got a ton of calls like, do I leave? Do I not leave? They didn't know where to go. It's just not in the regular everyday vocabulary as to whether you are in a dangerous zone or not. And some of those were mobile homes. And once you get water like that in a mobile home, it's pretty much done. So I think this is critical to talk about more. I think it's also really critical that we engage the public with feedback throughout the entire process of discussion. I want to hear from people as to what the issues were when they were in a flood and how these, can help them. Because what we want to avoid is, a disaster of people either getting hurt, dying, or whatnot from floods. And just because they haven't had a flood maybe in their particular area of the city or the county doesn't mean they won't have one in the future. And I know that we'll be talking about a climate action plan in the future, but this is part of that discussion as to how we can help mitigate the impacts. I personally would never want to live in the floodway or floodplain. I know that there's lots of beautiful homes on rivers, and people enjoy the view and the country. These are not typically affordable housing when they're on the major rivers, but sometimes they're very vulnerable communities in the floodway or the floodplains, and they may or may not own their homes. A lot of them may not, in which case they really don't have any alternative or a place to move should something disastrous occur to their actual housing, whether it be a home, or mobile home or whatnot. So I would really like to see more discussion about this, but just really stress that I would like to make sure that the public is invited to those conversations so we can get their feedback on the ground.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a number of things to say. First and foremost is thank you so much for this thorough report, and it does respond to at least the general request that we made to have a work session on this topic. All the things you listed, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. We need to be doing all those things. We need to be moving toward code language, alternatives, what can we do? What does the Oregon Model Floodplain Ordinance say about this? What are people doing in other counties? What's the cutting edge way to protect people? Secondly, I think that the moratorium and the idea of we hold a public hearing on a moratorium to see what the impact of that is going to be on people, I think is really important. Building in a floodway is obviously the worst of all those different options, and we really should have a moratorium on building within floodways. Again, when we talk about floodplains, floodways, near all of that, there's different land being affected, but that one, to me, is a public safety thing that we need to be working on and getting public comment on, and as Commissioner Buck pointed out, that people will need to know then more, but at least that's a way for us to really make it clear that we intend on doing something to stop this kind of potentially dangerous development in the floodway. Okay. Now, as to floodplain, I don't know if we just planned this or what, but National Public Radio did a big story on this whole topic on June 2nd. Are you aware of that?
I did not.
Yeah, they did a huge story on it, and one of the things they reported on is that local governments throughout the country are, I'll paraphrase this, they're fed up with these 50-year-old FEMA maps. Why are we making policy based on 50-year-old data that doesn't recognize what is really going on in terms of rainfall, snowfall, the persistence of flooding, and we have these, testimony from the public. There have been several 500-year floods in Lane County. So what they're using is a different technology called LIDAR. Have you heard of that? Okay. I wonder, can we put LIDAR technology, is it cheap enough to use? This is for those not following the LIDAR technology boom, the light detection and ranging technology, and it's coming out of North Carolina and Florida and other places that are having these massive floods, and they're not using, maybe they are to qualify for the federal insurance program, they're using the FEMA maps, but they're using LIDAR to try to figure out how to minimize these lowland flooding events that are just occurring at a huge pace right now. So I'm wondering, do we have this machine? How much does it cost? Who knows how to use it? Can we use it for radar detection on busy roads? What else? Can you use it now?
Well, we're actually going to be adopting new maps. I didn't include that as part of this presentation because it will be a separate ordinance process. But FEMA is going through the map revision process for coastal Lane County and the Coast Fork Willamette to get some updated flood risk maps, and they will be using LIDAR data. It's not a complete restudy, so they're just using newer topography data to update the flood maps.
Okay, excellent. What is the timeline to get back to us on a code or another work session, or move this down the stream, down the pike?
We're open-ended at this point. It sounds like there's interest in having a robust public engagement process as we move through this. So we would, we can certainly come up with some concepts or float these same ideas in a public meeting or multiple public
Can we
meetings.
separate one on the moratorium issue of floodway? I think you heard several commissioners talk about development in a floodway. Now, not everybody said moratorium, but proposing a moratorium in the floodway and the pros and cons legally and otherwise of doing that. And then moving on with a work session and continued work session and, why don't we have Mr. Clark and then Commissioner Bozievich?
I'll give my 2 cents on it. I think, sure, you can separate it or frankly combine it. I think as this board desires, it sounds like this will need to go to the Planning Commission at some point, and so folks can figure out whether you want to have public engagement before it goes to the Planning Commission or include that as part of the process.
Commissioner Bozievich?
Thank you. So I don't support the idea of a moratorium. Moratoriums on building should be reserved for pure health and safety reasons. We've done them in cases where we've overloaded soils on septic systems before. We already just heard from staff in the 5-year review from FEMA, we meet their minimum requirements. How we can then come back and defend a lawsuit against us for stopping development by a moratorium based on health and safety when we have the agency in charge of ensuring floodways telling us we meet their minimum requirements in our code. We will be up against a bunch of Measure 49 claims. I guarantee you will fill this room if we propose a moratorium with people that are concerned that they're not going to be able to build a shed on their property along the McKenzie, whatever it is. They'll construe it that way. If you want to spend a lot of controversy and develop some ill will towards the county, propose a moratorium.
Well, I didn't say we would propose a moratorium. I said.
Even
we would-
discuss a
We would have a
moratorium.
discussion of the pros and cons of it. And I want to be clear that Measure 49 does not prohibit counties from protecting public safety, and the purpose of this
That's why
is public safety.
That was why I said we would have to demonstrate it was for safety, and we just finished hearing from staff that FEMA told us we meet their minimum requirements. How can we say we're doing a moratorium based on safety if we're meeting FEMA's minimum requirements?
I thought
Flood
FEMA said we
insurance.
were doing what we needed to do to qualify for flood insurance.
Yeah, which still, you're going to have a tough time arguing safety when FEMA's blessed our program. That's what I'm trying to tell you, is you're setting yourself, if we go down the road of a moratorium, we are setting ourselves up for controversy and legal action. And I'm glad that staff answered the question about LiDAR, which, by the way, is only used to develop topography. That's all it does, is it's a way of sensing the ground through trees, to get accurate topo maps rather than the old aerial photogrammetry, which was not quite as accurate. It was only accurate within, a foot to 2 feet, and LiDAR can get you down to less than 1/10 of a foot. And they're actually redoing the North Fork Siuslaw maps now. In fact, I think that the revised maps are actually available if you want to see them. So that's what LiDAR is. But I think we would, I'm all supportive of looking at more protective code. I've stated where I'm supportive of that. I think we would be making a huge mistake of delving into moratoriums without a clear health and safety. People have a right in some ways to take risk. We don't prevent people from building in the tsunami zone in Florence and in Heceta Beach and unincorporated Lane County outside of Florence, even though we're 19 years past the subduction zone earthquake time period right now. We're past due for a subduction zone earthquake. We in this state decided it was okay to let adults imbibe in marijuana, which we all know has health risk involved. We have to have either some very clear public health and safety reasons to prohibit something. And I just don't think, with the protections already in our code protecting floodways and floodplains, that we can demonstrate the legal need for a moratorium. And that's my advice to the board, to not go down that road and generate a bunch of angst. The last time we started talking about buffers from watersheds and waterways, this room was filled so full it should have been shut down, the meeting, by the fire marshal. And you were here for that, I believe, Commissioner Sorensen. So I just think it's an unnecessary angst to drive the public through to even discuss a moratorium.
Okay, so Commissioner Burney.
On the one hand, I am not a fan of the nanny state, and I do agree that adults can take risks. On the other hand, here's what I heard, and here's what I certainly support. One is, yes, let's move forward on those policy considerations for greater safety that were laid out. Maybe I'm wrong, I didn't hear anyone state they wanted a moratorium. I didn't see that as an issue. What I heard, and please correct me, was both Commissioner Farr and Sorensen say we ought to look at the financial and the legal impacts of that. To me, that's not the same thing as imposing anything. It's just saying, look at it. So I didn't respond in the same way that Commissioner Bose.
I heard Commissioner Sorensen rephrase it differently.
Maybe
That he wanted to progress down that path, separate from developing the new land use standards.
Okay, so have you heard enough to see the tea leaves where the board wants to go? I think you do?
I believe so.
Okay, very good.
Could you be more fascinating, thorough, and interesting next time, though?
Yeah, it was good.
Try.
All right, so what's your time back? What's your estimate on that?
Yeah. This is, I have to be honest, a fairly large ask, and especially if we're going to engage the public, I would appreciate having the opportunity to work through the summer on this project and maybe reporting back to the board in the early fall, September or so, with a work session on this. We could give an update on some of the input we've heard from the public and maybe have some development around specific policies.
Okay?
If I may, Mr. Chair, perhaps if Mr. Clark fulfilled my tiny request, it may help inform us as to how much further we may want to go, may or may not want to go.
Sure, and what I understand is really just a quick rundown of what it takes to impose a moratorium. Yeah, we can do that in a fairly short term, next month, I suppose.
Good, that'd be very helpful. Okay, I think that concludes our discussion. Thank you so much. We're now ready to move on to item 13A, which is our report and order 19-06-11-08. This is the Legislative Committee update in order in the matter of adopting recommendations of the Lane County Legislative Committee. Joining us today, as always, to discuss the legislature and its important work is Alex Kyler, our Intergovernmental Relations Manager. Mr. Kyler and the Legislative Committee met, and we have some report for you. And Mr. Kyler, you can please proceed.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So before you have a packet that describes a number of things that we did during the meeting on May 24th. We've actually, while we tangentially discussed the Oregon Alcohol and Drug Commission during that meeting, we're bringing forward an item specifically related to the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission as well. So at any rate, you're going to have 4 items here in your packet, and if it's okay with you, I'm just going to take them in the order that they are. Attachment A is a legislative principles updated draft. There's one update that we recommended during legislative committee, and that was to make more permanent what has been a practice for several years, and that is supporting efforts to eliminate non-medical exemptions for otherwise mandated preventable disease vaccinations. So we've added that on page 4 of the legislative principles. It's a draft at this point in time, and would just take the passage of the board order to make that more permanent. But as you recall, we did include that as a standalone item in a previous meeting. There was a lot of discussion about a particular bill in Salem that was moving quite well until some things happened and the governor negotiated it away. My expectation is that bill will come back, not this session, but in the future at some point in time, and so it just seemed to make sense, since we've lobbied for that in the past, that we add it to the principles document. So if no questions about that, I'll just move on to the next item.
Okay.
The next item is attachment B. It's a letter to Congressman.
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are we amending our priorities to have that as part of the priority?
That's going to be the final vote of today's activities.
Okay, are we going to, hopefully we'll do these by separate votes because I do not support that.
Okay. Why don't we just go ahead and discuss that then, so we can get a decision on that. Alex, could you reiterate again that this is not on a particular bill, but it's about our legislative priorities, so that you and the organization know that this is a view of Lane County. Is that correct?
Correct. This is just a broad principle that guides us for current and future activity.
Okay, and so Commissioner, is that something you support or don't support?
My issue here, and this gets back to my basic libertarian principles, is educate people and change them through education. Do not use the force of government to have people do something they do not wish to do. You know, and yes, they're taking a risk, and and yes, there is a certain amount of risk to the population through herd immunity. But to require people to take immunization, even though they either have a false belief it's bad for them, or they have some other objection to it, is similar to prohibiting people from using marijuana. I don't support either. I don't support prohibitions, and I don't support mandatory medication. And I do not support us adding this to our list, even though I understand our public health folks would like us to have this. I just can't support it. I think it's a violation of people's rights.
All right, so let's have, to give all commissioners a point of view on this, let's have a motion to approve this as part of our legislative principles. Yes?
I'll move to approve update to Lane County 2009 legislative principles for under Health and Human Services for point stating support efforts to eliminate non-medical exemptions for otherwise mandated preventable disease vaccinations.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. So it's been moved by Commissioner Buck, seconded by Commissioner Farr to make the change as outlined in the motion to the legislative principles. Further discussion?
What number is that?
It's the blue one.
Isn't it
It's
adding?
attachment A.
I'm looking at attachment A.
Go down, and there's a blue highlighted.
Thing.
On page 4. Page 4 of the principles.
Is it in,
Funding for evidence-based.
I apologize.
It's not numbered, but it's the 48th bullet point.
48 bullet point.
No, it's not.
Yeah, that's right.
I see it. I see it. Thank you very much. I'm with you. Okay, I apologize.
And this is because we want to have a clear what the legislative priorities are. And so we were under the impression that that would be relatively non-controversial. Okay, go for it.
I just want to express my support for this particular bullet point. I know it can be controversial, as it has been in the legislature. And it may be something that comes up again down the road, but as a mom of a little girl going into school, this is especially important to me, to make sure that our kids are safe and the rest of our vulnerable population is safe. So I absolutely support this particular addition.
Further comments? Yep.
Yeah, I have to say I do too. I would like to say it's for the same reason, but I can't. It's because I'm the grandparent of not a parent, but the grandparent of a 9-year-old little girl that there actually are some children at the school who are not getting vaccinated, and everybody's kind of freaked out. So I appreciate what you're saying, but I think that this is so significant for general public health.
Yep.
Thank you. And our Public Health Advisory Committee has had a robust and lengthy discussion on this, and this comes at their recommendation. And they've not done it in a vacuum. They've certainly had the opposing testimony at just about every single meeting. So it came out of the Public Health Advisory, and I believe, as I recall, it was a unanimous vote of the Public Health Advisory Committee to recommend, not these exact words, but this policy.
Thank you. I think there is a personal component to this, whether it's your child or grandchild. But my grandchildren, ages 4 and 8, 5 and 8, live in Portland. They don't live very far from the school in Vancouver where there was a big outbreak of a communicable disease. And so, you know, I think we all have certain libertarian tendencies, but I guess as it applies to children, they're going to be in public school, most of them, a lot of them, hopefully all of them, will be in some sort of school. And if they're in school and they don't have any control over over what other people do, but we can make this a legislative priority down the road. Now, the governor apparently withdrew her support briefly from this, briefly enough that it's not going to happen in this session. But that doesn't mean that the counties and the officials that govern those counties that have to look out for a broad public interest, we should probably include this in ours. So, anything further before we vote? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
Vote is 4-1. Commissioner Bozevich voting no, and the legislative priority is adopted. Okay, let's go down the second one.
Okay, attachment B is a draft letter to Congressman DeFazio. This was a conversation that we've had. This is a letter that addresses the Leeburg Fish Hatchery. It's a conversation that has been sort of ongoing here since the board took a position to support inclusion for some funding for the Leeburg Fish Hatchery in the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife budget. We, upon getting that support for that issue, one of the things that I did was engage our federal lobbyist in a discussion about the transfer of the Leeburg Fish Hatchery from the United States government under the auspices of the Army Corps of Engineers to the state of Oregon, Oregon Fish and Wildlife Department specifically. And they came back and suggested that it may be better to support actual language in the Water Resources Development Act rather than sort of wait and go through the General Services Administration procedure for transferring that property. Now, I want to make clear that this is not something that the county is going to be receiving. We're really just trying to play a support role here in assisting the transfer of this. And so the letter, what I wanted to say about this letter is that I think we ought to link this to whatever action the Fish and Wildlife Department takes, if any, with respect to what's going to happen with the Leeburg Fish Hatchery. It's still not completely clear to me what will happen in Salem with this. So I've had conversations with the director and deputy director of ODF&W. They're very interested in this, but they want to make sure that this short-term budget issue gets resolved so that they can indeed continue to operate the fish hatchery as we then take the sort of the longer view of how do we actually assist in the transfer of that property and potentially find some federal stream of money to help support its operations. Now, the most recent action on this is that the ODF&W budget did pass out of both the subcommittee and the full Ways and Means Committee last week without the funding for Leeburg. So there was a bit of a dust-up in the subcommittee. There was a delay in the vote while there was a last-minute attempt to get the $1.7 million that the agency had requested into their budget, but that ultimately was unsuccessful. So the most recent development here is that this morning there was a new bill introduced. And it is a bill that will transfer ownership or operations from ODF&W to state parks. And it's kind of an interesting move because state parks have access to lottery money where ODF&W does not. And all along, the problem with the Leeburg Fish Hatchery money was that it was a general fund request, and one of the co-chairs of Ways and Means was saying absolutely not general fund. So with this new bill being introduced, they've got a new source of money for this, which would be lottery revenue, but it is just being introduced now, maybe 2 to 3 weeks before the end of the legislature. So it's got to get through a couple of committees and chambers in order to advance. I think it will, but again, my recommendation is that you approve this letter, but we might want to sit on it for just a little bit to see what happens with all these machinations in Salem before we actually send the letter.
I should say Oregon State Parks instead of ODF and W.
It might need to say, it might need to say state parks, and it may need that, mean that we sort of have to shift our focus to that agency and sort of re-educate them about the Water Resources Development Act and why that's a good idea. It may be that we want to say, instead of any agency, that it's just state of Oregon ownership, which may be a little cleaner at any rate. So this is, like I said, this was, I think it's a timely letter. It's just not quite ready because there is still a little bit of, like I said, machinations going on up in Salem.
I'll move approval of the letter.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the letter with the understanding that it might include a different agency at the point that it's ready to be sent. Okay, any further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Please say no. Motion carries 5-0. All commissioners voting in the affirmative. Okay, number 3.
Number 3, attachment C, which is a National Association of Counties resolution. Commissioner Bernie, Commissioner Buck, I don't think you've been through one of these processes yet, but essentially we are a member of the National Association of Counties. When Commissioner Bozovich and I were in D.C. This winter, we visited with the National Association of Counties. When Commissioner Farr and I were in D.C., we visited with the National Association of Counties. There's a very interesting process that they utilize twice a year at their annual conference and their at their annual summer conference and their legislative conference, which is held in the winter, where they entertain resolutions, which are sort of a policy issue that a county wants them to work on. And so they entertain from the entire country these resolutions that are all standard in format, and they're basically ideas, and they're suggestions for the association to advocate for counties on a whole ton of different issues. And those get processed through subcommittees and up to their board of directors, where they're either don't make it through the process or they do make it through the process and become part of a policy platform. So if you go on to the NACO webpage, you can see their national county platforms, and these include some statements about policy and then specific resolutions that are issues that have bubbled up. So the one that we have worked on pretty significantly, Commissioner Farr carried it, was had to do with healthcare and privacy laws. And there's some conflicting federal statutes around regular health privacy and then privacy laws around drug treatment in particular. And as we worked through things like the frequent user system engagement, FUSE, we realized, this is very tough to share information about high utilizers of public safety and health systems. And so that's an issue that we've worked on for a number of years. Going way back, we worked on some timber stuff and about the Stafford Emergency Act and stuff like that. But at any rate, this one is being proposed. If you recall, Lane County was party to a lawsuit involved for, I think there were 14 Oregon counties that were suing the Mortgage Electronic Registry System, Inc. And this is a national system that was developed by the banking industry to help to securitize mortgages. And so if you've seen the movie The Big Short, you know that there was sort of an elaborate process to create mortgages that would be bundled and then sold very rapidly. And the idea was that if you had to go to the county recorder every single time you sold one of those mortgages, it would be burdensome and expensive. And so MERS got developed, and the interesting thing about MERS is that they can list MERS as a beneficiary and without naming the actual holder of the note. And this became a big problem during the foreclosure crisis. So unfortunately, Lane counties and the other 13 counties that were party to the lawsuit, we were unable to prevail in that suit. It was dismissed with prejudice. But it's been an interesting issue. We've had, in fact, now 2 sessions trying to battle a piece of legislation in Salem that would make it illegal for a county to bring a lawsuit like that, and it would have retroactively implicated our lawsuit when this bill first appeared in the 2018 session. So it's something that we've dealt with for a number of years. And when we went to NACO, we did talk about there are a number of these lawsuits that have been undertaken all across the United States by counties who feel that they're damaged in several ways or injured in several ways. One is that they do not get recording fee revenue, so every time that one of those property transaction occurs, with MERS listed as a beneficiary, they're not getting an actual recording fee. And the index is corrupted because we really don't exactly know who owns a property at any particular given time. So the idea here that we brought forward is to ask Congress to direct a study to be undertaken under a certain section of the Code of Federal Regulations by a federal agency called the Federal Housing Finance Agency. The Federal Finance Housing Agency does do these kinds of studies at direction of Congress. And so what this resolution would ask is that the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency undertake a study and report annually to Congress on the amount of public recording fees not collected due to property transaction practices occurring through MERS. So rather than sort of take the step that we were seeking with our lawsuit, which was to prohibit the recording of a property with MERS listed as a beneficiary, the idea here is to ask Congress just to study this issue, and then perhaps, depending on the outcome of that study, we take this to the next level to either figure out how to capture that revenue or to ask Congress potentially to pass a federal law that would limit that. So I think it's an interesting resolution. It did go through the AOC process yesterday, and AOC did adopt it. Just let me back up a sec. So there's a couple different ways that resolutions can go. An individual county can suggest and carry a resolution to the annual conference, or the state association can carry it. And I wasn't exactly sure if anybody was going this summer to the annual conference, and because this has been a statewide issue, we actually did send this thing up through AOC, and since their meeting was scheduled before yours. So they did adopt this resolution yesterday, but I wanted to at least brief the board on.
Should we do it, or should we just hold it that AOC did it and it's going to go to the national convention?
Well, I guess my question is, nobody is going to, is anyone going to Las Vegas this summer? I am, yeah. But
Okay, I'm not.
No one's asked.
So if,
You can go, yeah, if you want to go.
Carry the resolution if you are going.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why I asked Chair Sorensen, is because if there is a member who is going, it'd be nice to get them to carry this thing, because
Yeah.
we have been involved with it. Be happy to sort of brief whoever that person is more
I was
on
going
that
to mention, Alex did a great job of overview of the NACO process. One of the things that's a good way to cut your teeth on this is, and Commissioner Farr and I have both done it, I don't know about Jay, I think you have, but anyway, the committees meet ahead of the March NACO legislative meeting, and that meeting is a very long day and very involved, and various committees are meeting, and that's where you get to present these resolutions for discussion by the appropriate NACO committee. And if the NACO committee approves it, which they often do, then it goes to the convention in the summer. NACO meetings are usually in March and July. And so it can be an educational process. And also in the case of the one that Commissioner Farr and I worked on, the staff, our staff, were among the most knowledgeable people in the country on it. And it really made it a lot better.
We drove that thing.
Alex and I were just connecting some dots, so
Yeah.
I'm going to be at the annual conference as part of the National Association of County Administrators Board, and as a representative on that board, I'm actually on the Finance, Pension, and Intergovernmental Committee. So I certainly can, but it would be great to have a commissioner,
Yeah.
if there's a commissioner that is able to attend, particularly one of the newer commissioners.
Yeah. And it's usually a down week. We usually set up the board schedule as a down week.
Can I ask a question? about
Yeah.
this? Alec?
Yes.
Were this to occur, would it or would it not preclude the practice of aggregating loans that banks and funds do and then selling them to the secondary market?
No,
No what?
no, it would not. It's a resolution about getting Congress to figure out how much money counties are losing.
I appreciate that, but maybe that's the correct answer, but the reason I'm asking it is because when those loans are aggregated, I don't know, the question becomes, how does the person that buys the aggregated product of $100 million worth of, in this case, home loans, how does one, if one is in default, know who the property owner is? And that's why I asked the
They don't.
They don't.
Yeah. That was the issue during the foreclosure crisis, that's why we had these zombie homes, because nobody
still
knew
an
who
issue.
owned them.
But that's my point. Is it still an issue even
Yeah.
if this is moved
Yep.
through, or will this
For
solve?
instance, I have a home on Territorial just outside Veneta city limits where the owner's gotten into addiction and has defaulted on his mortgage. They've actually gone through partial foreclosure and then stopped the process. It's a MERS traded security. Have no idea who actually really should own that parcel. They're living in a red tagged property. They had a fire at the house over the winter because they were heating it with wood, because they had no power, because they had their electricity cut off too. And the house has been red tagged. They've been living in sheds and RVs. They're collecting tires. They will not leave the property. But all of our nuisance abatement fees are second position to that MERS mortgage. We can't really foreclose and remove those people from the property because if we foreclose on our lien, we're still second position. It doesn't mean we end up, it's not like they haven't paid their taxes because the MERS people have a mortgage, financing company that pays the taxes on the property, even though the people are in default of the mortgage. They keep the taxes up so they don't go into tax foreclosure, so they don't lose their first position. So it is insidious how that works, and it's not the first property we've had something similar like that happen in Lane County. During the 2008 crash, post that, it was a horrible problem for zombie houses, trying to figure out who owned them, if there were squatters in them and all that. Now it's more of an issue of people falling into default and then not moving out because no one takes action against them. Some mortgage financing company takes care of keeping the taxes paid so they don't get kicked out for tax foreclosure. And they're violating every nuisance code. These people are collecting used tires, supposedly for resale. And they've built up, I think, $70,000 worth of lien against the property so far in fines. But we can't do anything about it hardly.
I was just curious.
Chair Sorensen and Commissioner Bernie, just to answer your question, so the first lawsuit that was filed in Oregon was a Multnomah County solo. They went on their own. I think Council Dingell's here, he can describe more, but I think we made a decision not to join that first lawsuit. That first, Multnomah County actually won, they settled that lawsuit. And the settlement agreement says that in Multnomah County, you may not record a deed for which MERS is the beneficiary. And as far as we can tell, that hasn't slowed down a single thing in Multnomah County with respect to deed recordation.
Okay, so why don't we, just to keep our record clear here, why don't we have a motion that we support this resolution? So that if the county administrator or commissioner or both go to the convention, they can support it. Okay.
I'll move to support the resolution supporting a federal study to examine lost recording fees due to the mortgage electronics registration system, MERS.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to support the resolution at the NACO convention concerning MERS. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please vote no. Motion carries 5-0, all commissioners voting, and the motion is adopted. And number 4 of 4.
Yes, so this would be attachment D. So the Oregon Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission, again, this was a sort of a late-ish addition to your agenda today, but we did discuss a pertinent bill in legislative committee, which was House Bill 2638. And House Bill 2638 has now passed both chambers. I think actually even the governor has signed it, but it expands membership on this statewide Oregon Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. And we note that there is just one person from Lane County who's been on that commission. They are tasked with creating a strategic plan to reduce drug and alcohol addiction in Oregon, and they're supposed to produce that for the legislature by 2020. They were mandated to do this study through a bill, House Bill 4137, I believe, was the bill in 2018. And there was a preliminary step that they were to report to the legislature on a framework plan. So they did spend some time creating a framework plan, and now their next step is to actually finalize that plan. House Bill 2638 expands their membership, and we discussed it at legislative committee because in addition to county commissioners, it now has potential seats for county administrators and staff people. So that was, we talked about it a little bit. Concurrent to that conversation, this Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission is going out on a statewide tour to get comments on their framework plan. And they're going to a bunch of cities around the state of Oregon, not including Eugene. And so staff had reached out to me to say, hey, we want to provide comment on the plan, but they're not coming here. And I said, well, why don't we just bring it to the board because it'll carry a little bit more oomph if we can get the board to sign on to these comments. So there's 2 essential comments that we've put into this letter. And the first is that while the committee's framework plan sort of gives some, probably I would say maybe a little bit more than lip service to the idea of prevention, their staff doesn't think their thoughts are all that well evolved on prevention activities. And when I speak about public health prevention, we've got, staff right down the street who work in prevention quite a bit, and they're very passionate about their work, and it's not necessarily focused on preventing drug addiction in the future. It's about creating, wellness in the future. And so we think that the challenge in the framework plan is that it's really focused on drug use prevention, whereas really in the public health world, it's about creating healthy people in the future who won't necessarily be susceptible to drug addiction. And so we've tried to, sort of bolster that type of thinking with our comment about supporting their guiding principle of prevention, but sort of suggesting they might be able to do a little bit better job about it if they think more broadly and specifically about what public health prevention is really about. We also speak to the lack of the legislative action to adequately fund public health modernization, which speaks a great deal to prevention. And we think that, you know, the more we can leverage that commission to also talk about adequately funding public health modernization is a good thing. So there's that comment. And then the other comment that we make is really they did not spend much time in their framework plan talking about revenue streams to support this work. And I think the board is plenty aware of a couple of issues that we've had around effective marijuana taxation and revenue allocation, the beer and wine tax and lack of increases or local ability to assess a beer and wine tax in Oregon. There's been there was a bill this session that we actually took a position on to support a tax framework for opiates, and we mentioned that in the letter, and then a couple other sort of broadish use of criminal fines account allocations, and then just generally tax preemptions that limit local revenue raising authority. So I think it would be, we think it's a good sort of letter that reminds the commission that they really ought to focus some work on these revenue streams to help support this strategic plan as they develop it. So sort of two broadish comments, and if you approve, Chair Sorensen, your signature and name will go on the letter, and we'll send it along to the Drug and Alcohol Policy Commission.
Okay, and does this involve also the legislation to change the membership, or is that legislation already passed?
That's passed.
Okay. So I thought that was really good to have the opportunity for county commissioners, sheriffs, public health directors, lots of other different types of people on that commission.
Yes, and I just as a related, I think one of the things we talked about a little bit at the committee was there's a process in the governor's office for accepting applications for statewide commissions. What I don't think we have necessarily very robust within the Lane manual or APM is sort of, well, how do we populate, particularly from staff, if there's somebody who wants to be on a statewide commission, does it have to come in front of the board first? Should it be a board member rather than a staff
Do you get
person?
notices from the governor's office on the vacancies?
I do not, but I do monitor those.
And commissioners, can you ask the governor's office to send the vacancies to the commissioners and department directors?
I probably can.
That's one way, I think, and I appreciate this discussion because there are a number of people truly that are experts on things that either work for Lane County or are on our advisory committees, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be in that pipeline.
Right. That's one of the things we discussed at Legislative Committee was that when you look at the statewide advisory commissions, you typically don't see great representation from Lane County. And, you know, we could undertake some work to try to be more proactive about populating these.
Yeah. But for now, I guess we'll just say that we have this, is it a letter? Is it in a letter form?
It'll be a letter
Yeah,
form.
so do you want board authority for that, or, yes?
I'd like to
Okay, this time I'll accept a motion if someone wants to make one to approve the letter concerning the Alcohol and Drug Policy Committee's work, commission's.
I'll move that.
Second.
Been moved by Commissioner Farr, seconded by Commissioner Bozievich to approve the letter to the state concerning the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. Okay, further discussion? Yes,
I'm sorry, you were going to talk?
No particular order, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to vote yes on this, but since this is discussion, I would request that legislative, that you come back and give us a sense of how you would like to see Lane County populating certain committees and groups, what they are, and the plan to do that. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I agree with him. You know, we do have a local alcohol and drug planning committee, which is a part of the mental health advisory committee. We do regularly contribute, but like Alex says, it's kind of puzzling that that Eugene got skipped in this. But this should help mitigate that a little bit. And about 4 years ago, Tony Biglin, who I believe is still the one member from Lane County, submitted to the governor my name for membership on that committee. But that committee kind of went out of regular session for a while. And I'm presuming that it's back operating and functional. So
Got a mandate.
looks like it. Yeah.
Got a mandate, and it's got an expanded committee now, so.
It would make a great deal of sense that somebody from Lane County, besides Professor Biglin, were on that committee, so, thanks.
I'll just say, on the substance of this, I think it's great that we're, writing this letter. On the broader topic that Commissioner Berney brought up, namely how we can get more people from Lane County involved, I will tell you that one of the problems is on the receiving end, and I've had a role on the receiving end, is that there are so many people banging down the door of the governor's office trying to get appointed to all these things, that they're really not in an outreach function. It's not like, oh, we have this alcohol and drug commission. I guess we better reach out and try to get somebody to apply for it. There are people applying all over the place for these things. And so if we want to do this, we have to be much more aggressive. It has to be more of a OSU beaver rather than some kind of, lichen on the wall trying to get some nutrients as it's going by. I mean, it's really much more aggressive. And when I was on the Senate Appointments Committee, which all these appointments go to the Senate Appointments Committee after the governor nominates people. And so then there's this thousands of people writing letters in, please appoint my friend, please appoint my college president, please appoint my county administrator, please appoint my commissioner. And you've got legislators and all these people, cajoling you and trying to get you to appoint them. So there's really no thought out there like the one Commissioner Berney, like, hey, I would be interested in this. It's much more aggressive. You have to go after this. And a lot of people just aren't willing to do that, and they're not willing to drive 300 miles to these state meetings. And so really people have to really want to do it. But I agree, we've got tremendous resources, not just in the county, in law enforcement, corrections, public health, on and on, efficiency in government, I mean, just all those things. So I would really encourage the commissioners to stay in touch with Mr. Kyler, and also maybe we can get the governor's office, the executive appointments assistant, maybe they're willing to come down here and give a talk about this topic, because that's the person that really coordinates this whole function in government.
So you may not know, but I have 2 gubernatorial appointments right now.
So maybe you're the expert currently. Yeah. Talk to Jay on how to get appointed.
I serve on the Criminal Justice Commission's Grant Review Committee, and I serve on the Cleaner Air Oregon Rules Advisory Committee. Both of them were gubernatorial appointments, but they're on behalf of AOC.
Yeah.
So one of the things of getting into governor's committees is attend AOC and participate in AOC.
Absolutely, because AOC will be one of the groups that the governor's office will choose from, for sure. Okay, so we're done, right?
Well, I guess so. I think.
Did we vote on the
I don't
last
think
one?
you voted on the,
Did we vote on number 4?
no.
No. We're having further discussion on number 4. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll vote. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. And Motion number 4 is approved.
Okay, so now I don't exactly know, Chair, how you want to rectify this, but you did have a board order that encompassed all 4 of those items. And I
Okay.
think you sort of departed from the board order when you heard
Yep.
Commissioner Bozovich talking about his opposition to the
Okay.
first one. So I can just imagine there's a board secretary upstairs wondering what you're going to do with this board order.
So maybe Commissioner Bozovich, you would have a suggestion on how to handle that.
We've had 4 separate motions to approve letters and legislative, I don't know if it has to be stated in a board order or not.
I think the problem with the motions has been in the past that it doesn't sort of get memorialized in the same way that an actual order does.
If we take it up as a slate, I'm going to have to vote no. But now that you've seen, we've had the previous motions,
Yeah.
people can go
Yeah.
back and see I actually supported the other 3, but if just,
I mean, the other option is I can just,
I can't vote yes on mandating, and overriding parental.
And this happens all the time here at the board where commissioners will vote on different motions, and then there'll be some sort of final thing. We'll see that next week with the budget. There's all kinds of ways to handle it. That's why I called on Commissioner Bozovich, just to let you know, this will come up. All of us will have this kind of thing, so just how you want to handle it.
well, Mr. Chair, the other option is I can do it as a review of assignments, and we can put it that way, it gets memorialized as individual, or
Okay.
individual items.
Yeah.
That then get put on as assignments.
Well, let's just do it that way then. That way,
And
we
then
don't
it's
have a board order,
memorialized.
but we do have board decision, and it's memorialized in your review.
Okay, thank you. I guess I will just conclude by saying that, we are here in the waning days of the legislative session. There are a bunch of budgets that have already passed. There are some that will be not until the very end, like the Health Authority and the Department of Human Services. Those will be several of the last budgets out of the building. There's a capital projects budget. That will be one that's out, the last out. The lottery bonding bill, that'll be another one that's last out. And then the really last one is called program change, which is also sometimes referred to as a Christmas tree bill because certain things.
What are they going to do with the money they were thinking of giving us for our courthouse?
Yeah,
Still
that's
trying to get them to give it to us.
They're going to give it to us?
Well,
They're going to reserve it?
He's working on it.
I'm working on
Oh,
it.
you're working on it, okay.
Working on.
So,
We didn't change direction as far as our legislative priority
Right.
goes.
yeah,
Right,
still our top priority.
all right.
There's a couple of bills that are really sort of driving everything, which is cap and trade, family leave, and probably tobacco tax. Those are 3 big ones that are still uncertain about what's going to happen. And so I wish I could tell you that I know more. I've been watching very closely, and there's a lot of behind closed doors conversations going on about scheduling and ordering and that sort of thing. So there's still an awful lot in play. And, if at any time you have a question about what's going on, just call me and I'm happy to chat about what I know or can find out about various things. But we are getting into the end game, the so-termed end game here. A lot of negotiations that go on in the end game for votes, but it's close. We'll probably be done the last week in June. I think constitutionally they need to be done by July 1st, and they had been targeting for June 21st. So I think it'll be right in that window of the last week in June that they will actually adjourn sine die.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we are back on our agenda for item 14A, County Council announcements. And just as an intro, several commissioners have asked Mr. Dingle questions about the various pesticide cases and the status of those cases, and so that's part of his announcements today.
Thank you, Chair Sorensen. I'll start with some more routine ones. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but we have hired a new support person in our office. Her name is Grace Ogden. We stole her from parole and probation fairly and squarely, so She's been working for us for a couple of weeks. And to pick up on one of the comments that you made, I do have a couple of attorneys in my office who serve on various commissions, one on the Criminal Justice Commission, and one, I believe, is the president of the Architects Board. And I've basically taken the position that those are, A, good professional growth opportunities, B, a good way, in both instances, both of the attorneys have a particular expertise that I think they can lend to each one of those committees. And I think it's good for the county to have folks that are out on those statewide boards. And I just made that, they came to me and asked if they could be on it, and I said they could. That was the process that was followed. Although I believe in each instance, they were recruited and asked to put their name in, so. Yes, just briefly, I want to let the board know that we have scheduled an executive session for a much more in-depth and probing discussion of these issues for July 9th, and I set aside, Ms. Jones asked how much time I thought it would take. I put down 45 minutes. If at the end of this presentation you think that's insufficient, let me know. There will be a great deal of written material that you'll be able to review before that executive session. Just to clarify, this is, I know there's a lot of confusion around these initiatives, so I thought what I'd do is just, and then there was a bunch of testimony about these today, so I just thought I'd quickly summarize for folks who may have been watching that, who really haven't had it laid out in a linear fashion so they understand where the county is. There are three cases involving these various, these initiatives, primarily the aerial spray ban and the community self-government measures. The first case, which was entitled Stanton Long versus Betchart and Dingell, yes, I was the Dingell, was a suit brought when Ms. Betchart had approved the circulation of the petition on, I believe it was the aerial spray measure. Mr. Long filed a lawsuit contending that she'd violated her duties in that she had not conducted a review of the measure for compliance with the separate vote requirement, which is a constitutional requirement, codified in ORS 203725 sub 2. The petitioners took the position that, A, you couldn't challenge it pre-election on that ground, but if you did, you only had 60 days to do it. And more than 60 days had passed since the clerk had approved the petitions for circulation, therefore it couldn't be challenged. The county took the position that the way that the statute was written didn't require the clerk to do anything until she had verified the requisite number of signatures, because it was only at that time that the matter would be presented to the electors, which is the language that's used in 203725 sub 2. Judge Rasmussen heard those arguments. He agreed with the county's position that the clerk had no obligation to review the measure at that time. So it proceeded on. The supporters of that measure did not like the ruling. They appealed it. And on January 28th of this year, the Court of Appeals affirmed Judge Rasmussen's opinion without opinion. It's called an AWOP.
2019?
1/28/19 was the date of the AWOP by the Court of Appeals. While that case was working its way through the system, the petitioners gathered the requisite number of signatures. They were verified by Ms. Betchart, and thus, pursuant to Judge Rasmussen's ruling, triggered her obligation to review the measure for compliance with the separate vote requirement. She did that with my assistance, and we determined that the measure did not comply with the separate vote requirement. So she declined to put it on the ballot. Again, the petitioners challenged that decision. In this case, Mr. Long intervened in the lawsuit. It became an intervener. Basically, throughout this process, it's the same three parties all over again. It's the petitioners represented by various individuals, Mr. Long, and the county through Ms. Betchart or myself, simply switching roles. In one case, we're the defendant, the next case, we're the plaintiff, another case, someone's an intervener. That case was heard by Judge Rasmussen. He agreed with the clerk that
What was the name of that case?
I knew you were going to ask me that. That one was Bowers et al. Versus Betchart. The first one was Bowers versus Betchart Dingle with Long as the intervener. The one I just told you was Bowers et al. Versus Betchart with Long as the intervener. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, it's okay.
Who is Bowers?
Well, these are just individuals, so it gets very confusing. Basically, they're people who,
I'm sorry.
I think they may be the chief petitioners, Commissioner Burney, of the petition.
I thought the Bowers in that case was Ray Bowers, maybe not.
There's 3 or 4 people. I believe her first name was Lynn Bowers. There's Robin Bloomgarden. Another person who I'm not sure how you pronounce it, the name is like OTJA, Tia Ocha, I don't know. They're essentially, I believe they're all 3 or 4 folks that are either chief petitioners or actively involved in circulating these petitions. So Judge Rasmussen ruled that the aerial spray measure did not comply with the separate vote requirement and agreed with Ms. Betchart's decision not to place it on the ballot because it didn't meet the constitutional qualifications. That decision was appealed to the Court of Appeals. It has been briefed. No date has been set for oral argument. While those cases were pending, the petitioners gathered the requisite number of signatures for the community self-government measure. Again, those were presented to Ms. Betchart. She verified that they had the requisite number of signatures. Again, she did the review required by the original decision by Judge Rasmussen, determined that it did not meet the constitutional qualifications, violated the separate vote requirement. That case was argued in front of, because by that time, Judge Rasmussen had retired, so Judge Shanti heard that case, and she agreed with Ms. Betchart's decision that it did violate the separate vote requirement, and it should not have been put on the ballot. Again, the proponents appealed that. That case has been appealed to the Court of Appeals. Again, it's been briefed, but I don't believe oral argument has been set yet. So all 3 of those, that's where all 3 of those cases come from Lane County. There's another one which I don't want to get into out of Marion County, which I'll discuss in detail when we're in exec session. But at the end of the day, the county is currently under, and this board is under a binding circuit court decision in 2 of the cases and a decision from the Court of Appeals that those respective measures as they were written and presented do not comply with the constitutional requirements to be placed on the ballot.
As initiatives.
As initiatives, yes. Yes, and I should make clear, these are, thank you, Chair Sorensen. To be clear, these are requirements that apply to, at the state level, constitutional amendments, and at the local level, charter amendments. So I just want to make, so that's just the sort of Joe Friday dragnet issue.
In Long versus Betchart, that case was affirmed by the Court of Appeals, the decision to not allow the not allow the initiative on aerial herbicide spraying to go forward, and it was the Court of Appeals, AWOP, the circuit court, that said it could not go to the voters.
No, Chair Sorensen. The very first case only dealt with the timing of the review. Oh. So the very first, the issue was, when it was initially raised was, when do you do the review for this compliance? Because when you review for compliance with the single subject, full text, those things, they're all done initially before the petition is ever circulated. If someone disagrees with that, they can appeal it. There's an appeal process to a circuit court judge. Long and short of it is that when it comes to single subject and full text, when you circulate your petition, you know that it meets the requirements. It will, if you get the requisite, at least on those grounds, it will get on the ballot. Mm-hmm. We did support Senate Bill 368, which was introduced, which would push the review for separate vote to the front. Just like, so essentially, every constitutional requirement to get an issue on the ballot would have been reviewed and decided up front before the individuals began circulating the petition. Unfortunately, it was opposed by some of the very people who are the petitioners in this. So as I understand from Mr. Kyler, the legislature said if those folks don't want it.
What I'm saying
we're not
is
gonna do it.
that you have 3 cases, Long v. Betchard, that was affirmed by the Court of Appeals.
Correct.
You have Bowers v. Betchard, and that is the judge rules it doesn't comply with the separate vote requirement.
The aerial spray measure
Been-
does not,
Been
yes.
appealed to the Court of Appeals, no date set for oral argument. And on the community self-government measure, that was taken to the circuit court. Judge Shanti ruled that violated the separate vote requirement and would not go to the voters. The petitioners appealed. It's at the Court of Appeals, no date for oral argument.
All the briefing's been done.
Okay.
It's just, there's just no date set for oral argument. I believe in at least, I'm pretty sure that the intervener in Mr. Long has requested oral argument in both cases.
And there's no cases involving us, at least, involving the power of the Board of Commissioners to put forth measures in front of the public.
No, no, the only way that that power is implicated is, and I think this is an important point to make, I'm not sure because I haven't talked to these folks, I believe that they are under the misapprehension that if the board, because the board does have the power to refer the amendment. However, your referral must comply with the, in other words, you can't as a board refer a measure that violates the constitutional requirements. So you can't refer 203, for example, the aerial spray or the community self-government one is written because there's a court order that says it violates the separate vote requirement. And I think people, I gather, just from listening to them, that they believe that if you refer it, that suddenly all those requirements are waived. The only requirement that's waived when the board refers one of these measures is the requirement to gather signatures. That's the only thing that goes away.
Very good. Other questions? And this will be subject to our executive session as well.
Just
Yeah, go ahead,
one
Commissioner.
quick question. In all of this, and the fact that those 2 initiatives did not make the ballot, was there any action the board took, either for or against promoting it, or anything that we did that as the board, that prevented them from getting on the ballot? It was all court actions, wasn't it, and third-party lawsuits?
Chair Sorensen, Commissioner Bozevich, that's correct. So in every one of those pieces of litigation, so in the first one, Mr. Long sued Ms. Betchart and myself, so we were the defendants, so we were essentially forced to respond. And then in the other 2, we were sued by the petitioners based on Ms. Betchart's decision that it didn't comply, and mine that it didn't comply with the separate vote requirement. However, that decision was made by Ms. Betchart in conjunction with consultation with me. It didn't involve any action by the board.
Thank you. I just wanted to make that clear because there's been multiple accusations and public comment that the previous board prevented those from being on the ballot.
Okay, Commissioner Bernie.
This relates to our conversation, and I don't want to misquote, but my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this isn't the first time such a proposed initiative has not met that requirement. And in fact, so we actually have a precedent for what you do when something like what one does as the petitioner if confronted with this. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yes, Chair Sorensen, Commissioner Bernie. Actually, the one case I didn't want to get into because
I'm sorry.
No, is Gedry versus Richardson, which is out of Marion County, which was actually Initiative Petition 55, which was the state version of the community self-government matter. And the the Attorney General determined that didn't comply with the separate vote requirement. So the Secretary of State didn't put it on the ballot. But yes, there's plenty of, I told you, probably to me, the most famous case is Armada versus Kitzhaber, which
You're
was,
talking to me about a crime bill.
that was the Crime Victims Bill of Rights. The original time that it was passed and enacted by the voters, it was a list of several rights. And it was challenged post-election, and the Oregon Supreme Court said it violated the separate vote requirements because, again, people should have been able to vote on whether or not victims have the right to be present at sentencing, whether victims should be notified of parole hearings, et cetera. So it had to go back, and when those petitions, I remember very well, when those petitions were circulated, the circulators had, I think it was 8 or 9 different petitions, and you had to sign a separate one for each one of the rights, and they were separately, the next time it came up on the ballot, you had to vote separately for each one of the rights that were listed.
Thank you.
So yes, there's case law on it.
Not all of them passed either, did they? When it was,
No, it's not all of them passed the, I don't remember the exact numbers, but no, that, if there were 10, like 6 or 7 passed, when they came back and revoted. So the original one had all, I don't know, this is a number I'm completely speculating on, but let's say there were 10 rights. Well, obviously, when they were all together, all 10 passed, but when they went and split them up, my recollection is that like 60 or 70% of those that were presented passed. They were all the same original ones, that just not all of them passed when they were split out.
Okay. All right.
So does the board think, based on that presentation, that 45 minutes is enough time?
I think so.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much for your report and announcements. And we will now move on to item 8A, which is our county administration announcements, if any.
Just a couple, Mr. Chair. We're very pleased with the progress at the courthouse block. The Roll Park lot, if you've noticed, is near completion, and it will open tomorrow, Wednesday, June 12th. There are 275 spaces, and it includes 7 accessible parking spaces. Vehicles can enter, I should say that initially it's going to be permit parking only until pay stations can be installed, which we anticipate will happen towards the end of this week. Vehicles can enter off of East 7th Avenue and Pearl Street. I think we've shared with the board that the material that's used, this Roll Park, this is the first project west of the Mississippi where this material has been used, so rather groundbreaking. And the material has a maximum weight limit of 9,000 pounds for vehicles, so to discourage large and overweight vehicles from entering the lot, we put an 8-foot overhead height restriction has been installed. So if you get questions about why are we putting a height restriction on an open surface lot, it's not a parking structure, that's the reason for the height restriction, is really to limit the weight of the vehicles that can go.
So height and weight are correlated.
They are correlated, yes. So the lot will be it will temporarily alleviate some of the parking strain in downtown Eugene, both for city, county, court employees, as well as for the public. So our employees and downtown businesses are very pleased that we have this temporary use. As the board recalls, we executed the purchase and sale agreement with the city of Eugene to acquire that property earlier this year in January, and we moved very quickly to get this material installed. So it's just been a few months, and I think a good example of how quickly we try to move those projects forward. And then I would say on the environmental front, important to know that this is a really environmentally friendly material that's being used. It actually absorbs fuels and liquids from vehicles from leaking and entering the watershed. So we're pleased with that as well. I'm happy to answer questions on that. And then I just want to touch briefly on, we had an assignment here for, related to the climate change assignment that we talked, I think it was 2 weeks ago, was that May 23rd. You got the update from staff. We're moving forward now and looking at bringing on a consultant to develop a robust climate action plan. One of the original assignments we had back in January was to have a professor, I believe it was a professor at the University of Oregon, University of Oregon, Mr. Nemi. And then there was a subsequent request to have a counter person present. And I want to just follow up. It was my read that we've sort of advanced past that place of having the sort of why conversation, and now we're into how and what are we going to do. So we have not scheduled those presentations to come forward because we felt like we actually have direction from the board to move forward to develop this action plan, but I wanted to seek your guidance on whether or not we should close that
Good.
assignment.
On Dr. Nemi, he's not a professor at the University of Oregon. He's a research economist who does consulting. He's an economic, natural resource economist that does consulting. So he wrote a paper on the economic impact of climate change on Lane County. That's what his paper's about. So it's not about Lane County government and what Lane County government's doing. It's about a broader topic of his report on the impact of climate change on the economy of Lane County. And so for myself, I see this as an important, report that he's done. And as far as I know, no one else has done a report like that. And so I would say we should hear from him, and it was part of my assignment that after we get the presentation, well, initially it was just to have him come and talk, but after it was modified that after we get the presentation on what Lane County is doing, then it would be appropriate then to bring Dr. Nemi to make his presentation about what he found in the report. So he did the report last year, November and December. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm happy to read a report if it's sent to me so I can understand it, but I think we have kind of moved on to, if we're going to have a consultant, I would think that that consultant would discuss what other people are doing in the United States or comparable counties, and then, full assessment of what we can do here. So I'm okay if somebody wants to submit a report for reading. I do email really well. If we want to move on, I'm supportive of moving the progression of the climate action plan a little bit faster.
That report was put on our website in
It
January.
was submitted as supplemental information to a board meeting, I think December 18th, if you go to our supplemental board materials. I think there's a link there to the.
No, it was earlier.
Was
I
it
mean,
earlier
later.
than
It was
that?
January.
It was in January.
Was it in January? Yeah.
January.
But I know it was linked to our supplemental materials because I have a copy of the report.
Yeah.
May
I have a paper copy.
I interrupt you? I remember vividly because it was my first Board of Commissioner meeting. Sorry to interrupt you,
Okay,
Jay.
yeah. But it was a while back, but it is available electronically, I believe, because I think it was given to Diana and she scanned it and put it on her website.
Okay.
Did you want to say something else?
I didn't know, were you through?
No, go ahead. I sorry, I was just jumping in on that, so she knew where the report was.
Two questions, if I may. One, it may be too late. Is it too late to put 2 or 3 or a few car chargers in that parking lot?
I can inquire on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And, yeah, that's why I was wondering if it was too late. I didn't know. And then, as it relates to climate action plan, thank you for moving forward. I think I would like to be involved in both the scope of work as well as the process of community engagement, because we have a lot of expertise, and there may be mechanisms for some sort of listening sessions or some mechanism to have a lot of community input into this. I think it's going to resonate with a lot. I don't think it needs to be that controversial at all. So I'd just like to have input into both scope of work and process of community engagement.
Just to respond briefly to that, Commissioner, Ms. Chair and Commissioner Burney, what I've talked about with our Public Works Director is that we're going to go out and pursue a process to select a consultant to do this work and then bring that consultant to the board for discussion about what this process would include, what the public engagement would look like, the role of the Board of Commissioners throughout that process. So that's our,
You're ahead of me, I'm sorry.
yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you articulate that. I just want to make it clear that this, the discussion we had 2 weeks ago is not going to be the last discussion you're going to have. We know this is a priority for the board. We're going to need to include it, I think, more specifically in our strategic plan so that it's reflected there. And then you will have an update. You know, my hope would be later this summer, once we have a consultant on board, we'll bring those folks here to seek more direction, guidance from the board. So what I guess I'm here, I want to clarify this again about whether or not the assignment is, we're on the right path and the assignment's completed, or you still would like to have, the assignment was originally to have Mr. Nemi or Dr. Nemi come and present, and as well as someone else who would have an alternative perspective. So that's the assignment as it currently says. The question is if the board still wants to pursue that, if the majority of the board wants to pursue that or not.
It's closed.
It's up to the board. Yeah.
Forgive my naivete. Are there such things as elective work sessions where if some of us wanted to hear a presentation, we could, but it didn't have to be a formal board work session, or is it one or the other?
We'd have to notice it. So anytime you're going to have a majority of the board
Okay,
in a meeting, we'd have to notice it.
okay, thanks.
And like Commissioner Buck said, the material can be read too.
Oh, it's been read, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm supportive of closing it and moving forward with the action plan and making sure I find that material that we had and reading it.
Okay.
Commissioner Farr.
Thanks. I'm supportive of, you know, what's really exciting is that both the director and our fleet manager seem to have great expertise and have both done research and actually taken some action. So it seems that we are poised to move forward with the broad involvement, broad input, and I'm looking forward to it. Whatever path we go from here, I'm presuming that we're all in favor of it for whatever reason, and we have a path that's not clearly defined, but is definable.
Okay.
Second is regarding the parking lot. Wow, that was a fenced lot since before I became a county commissioner. It was a fenced lot for almost 7 years, and we take charge of it, and all of a sudden it's being used. Wow, pretty amazing. Congratulations on fast action. The second part of that question is, what would it take to put up a couple of Conestogas on there? So I've asked that question. I'm presuming that there's some discussion regarding that. I'll not ask you right now for a response, but I'm interested in a couple at least Conestogas on the parking lot. So thanks.
Okay. Anything further by way of report?
Oh, I think I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. And then, since we didn't vote on that other board order, you were going to recount the board's
Want to do
decisions.
that now? The review of assignments.
Yep.
So I have these four that, the updated draft of the legislative principles. We're going to hold off on sending the letter to Congressman DeFazio, but the board did approve that regarding the Leeburg Fish Hatchery sale transfer. And motion to approve the support for the NACO resolution regarding the MERS study. And then then just send the letter of comment to the Oregon Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. So those 4 items, that's all I had.
Oh, the flood thing. The floodplain workshop we just had.
Yeah, there's
In the, right,
Yeah, we wanted to move forward with code language and public involvement.
right.
The fourth item, I don't think we ever voted on that, so we do have a motion with a second on the table that's not been voted on. So either withdraw the motion or vote on it.
I think we eventually did take the vote on the Alcohol and Drug Policy Committee letter. What we didn't take a vote on was the board order.
Yeah,
Right.
and we're not
No
taking,
one made
Not
a
going to do a
motion.
board order. We just decided
Yeah.
that we would codify it in the assignments.
yeah, okay, very good. Yes, Commissioner.
I have a clarification of a previous assignment that I made. Currently, it's on August 27th. And it was regarding, well, it's written currently here as Lane County, talking about Lane County's role in the census. I just want to be specific that my intent when I made that was to talk about redistricting. So, I mean, it's great to talk about the census too. I would like to ensure that there's also discussion about our language and our role in redistricting as well.
Yep. Thank you. We'll make that
Out in the
change.
charter. Yeah.
Okay, yes, Commissioner.
So did we skip Commissioner's business?
No, we have not skipped
Okay.
that. We are trying to
Because
finish.
Review of
8A.
assignments is usually after that, so.
No, we're trying to finish 8A, and I think that, Mr. Mokryski said, so we're moving to 16, and I unfortunately said yes. And so he started reviewing assignments, but my intent was to, no, it's my fault. And I do think this is some test to see how long we can go. But anyway, so we're done with 8A. Are you now, Mr. Mokryski, done with 16?
I am, yeah.
Okay. Now let's go to item 15A, which is Commissioners' announcements. Are there any Commissioner announcements? Commissioner Farr, then Commissioner Buck.
Just one, starting in 1997, I served on the Eugene City Council with Bobby Lee. Bobby served on the long-standing Council Committee on Homelessness and Youth alongside me and first Councilor Jim Torrey, then Mayor Jim Torrey. Bobby just this week was named, the permanent is the title. I don't know what they mean by permanent, but he's the director of the Office of Economic Development for the city of Seattle. Pretty big assignment for Bobby Lee, U of O student, former city councilor, and a good friend to many of us in this room. So congratulations, Mr. Lee, and good luck and Godspeed with your work with the city of Seattle. The second thing is, I love to talk about redistricting because I always think about, we don't want anything like Shed and the University of Oregon being in the same district, do we? Which it is right now, so. We won't have anything to do with state legislative district redistricting, but that is a pretty bad aberration, an example of how redistricting can go wrong.
Okay, go ahead.
I have two items. One, the first one is the Rural Broadband Speed Up America project was debuted Friday at the Oregon Economic Development Conference in Cottage Grove. So it is ready for everybody to use online. This is the one where you put in what your vendor is, how much you're paying, and then do a speed test and put it all together. And it develops very specific graphs of who's getting internet service, who's not getting internet service, and it goes all over the state of Oregon. At the conference on Friday, we had a lot of interest of people in different states, attended from Washington, Idaho, really interested in having this kind of information. It only works when we use it and put in data to present to either governmental agencies, associations. It will have eventually additions to make it for congressional districts and legislative districts. Right now, we're kind of combining it in different precincts. So I'm really excited about this rollout, and we'll probably have a little bit more information in the coming week or so about it. But check it out. It's just speedupamerica.com. I think it will be a game changer in what we talk about when we're advocating for funding for rural and broadband and just funding in general to make sure that we all have equitable access to internet. And the second item that I want to bring up, which Commissioner Bozievich mentioned earlier, I did attend the conference with Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo in Boise, Idaho, about 2 weeks ago. that I felt was successful. We had some good media present to get out the word about this endowment fund that could help provide a permanent solution to what we call the roller coaster of SRS funding. So I'm excited to see if that comes to fruition in Congress, and I'll be watching it closely. I think we all should be.
Okay, further announcements? Commissioner Burney?
My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that that's a $7 billion endowment they're looking at, and that 1/7 of that would be dedicated to Oregon. Is that correct?
The number is right, the billion is right.
You don't know about the other, the fraction?
I think there's a formula embedded in the entire thing that puts in a lot of factors to delegate which funding goes to which district in the counties.
And I'm just going to do this very staccato because I don't want to keep us here forever. I completely support, obviously, equitable access to the internet, and yet every time I hear the term speed up America at this point in life, I'm thinking, slow down America. But anyway, that's here nor there. I would like to mention that the Housing Policy Board at some point in the very near future is going to be asking the Lane County Board of Commissioners if and how they can be of value, perhaps as it relates to coordinating TAC implementation. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just giving you a heads up. I want to share that Springfield's mayor actually joined us at the last Housing Policy Board, and she didn't have the opportunity, but she was going to bring a list of housing and homeless areas the city of Springfield is tackling, and I believe 2 Springfield City Council people, including her, will be at our next TAC implementation board. Next, as your liaison on the workforce board, just to share that board's funding seems to really be on a last-second roller coaster right now. And the last word I received from Executive Director Christina Payne was that there was now, it was approved, it was not approved, and now there's new legislation that will be decided on Tuesday. So stay tuned as we determine right now what is an up and down roller coaster of whether Lane County will have a bulk of its workforce training system resources. That's it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll try and be brief, too. Yesterday, I was the only board member up at the Legislative Committee for AOC.
I wasn't at I was for.
You were Veterans in the morning, but
Veterans
not.
and Health, yeah.
Yeah, but not there for Legislative Committee, so I was there for that. And I also am on the board. So just report a couple things out. We already talked about the MERS resolution that went through. By the way, that went through unanimously, both in Governance Committee and in the full body. They also had resolutions dealing with the Economic Development Administration, the Willamette Valley environmental impact that the Corps is going through right now. And they also have one particularly on PILT funding for low population counties, which that's why I knew that it's 38 cents per acre is apparently there's a decrease in the per acre funding for 36 counties across the country, 11 of which are in Alaska, where they've reduced that per acre amount because of the large amount of acreage compared to population, and it's a resolution asking to kind of true that up and be fair to all, treat everybody the same with PILT, because 2 Oregon counties get dinged with that low population issue. So that, we cover a fair amount of ground. Also, there was one on Kratom and trying to get some work study done on best practices dealing with Kratom. So, pretty, pretty broad spectrum that AOC deals with up there. A little bit of report on the board, just because some of the newer board members might not be aware of the whole issue that happened with the finances kind of falling through the cracks for a couple years, and there was some unintended borrowing from road fund monies for general fund operations of AOC, because they have a significant portion of their operations that are funded through road fund, and that dissemination between funds wasn't done well. There's been a repayment plan to fix that, because you can't just use road fund money for anything other than roads, which there is a significant function as they run that, one of the asset management systems for most of the state for county roads. But that's in progress. They've almost got most of the repayment done, and they've got a plan to finish that out. So that was a piece of good news. The other thing that's going on is they're out for proposals right now from recruitment firms for an ED. They're going to go for an outside recruitment for permanent executive director. That was a decision of the board last board meeting, and we just had a report back in this board meeting. But just so you're aware, they're in the process of getting a recruitment firm on board and start that process of recruiting and selecting an executive director for AOC.
Makes Martha happy.
Is the interim going to apply?
I hope so, because I believe he's doing a great job, and I think he'd do well in the process. But I think it's important to have a clear process. In fact, a lot of associations require an outside recruitment for ED replacements rather than going strictly internal, because sometimes it can look like a good old boys network, and then questions of equity and access become involved. An outside recruitment that ends up selecting an internal candidate, then those questions are pretty much answered.
Okay. Couple of quick announcements on my part. First of all, I'd like to thank Devin Ashbridge and the Health and Human Services people. When the point-in-time count data was released, they were very helpful to me in responding to questions from the news media about the trend in the point-in-time count, the homeless, the requirement that we conduct a point-in-time count. So I just wanted to say thanks for that. And also, if today's light schedule of the board was enjoyed by all, the agenda team concocted a much more aggressive schedule for next Tuesday involving a 9 to 3:30 p.m. set of meetings, breaking briefly to allow us to drive to the Kiefer Center in Springfield and have our evening public comment session at 5:30 at the Kiefer Willamette Lane Center. And thanks to our friends at Willamette Lane for making that available to us. And then we'll have a big Wednesday, that's 6/19 as well. So with that, I think we are ready to move to item 15B, which is agenda team requests and work session requests. And I'll call on any commissioners that want to make that. Notice how I mentioned the next Tuesday and Wednesday work program before I ask if we want to make suggestions for further work. Yes?
So this is not necessarily a board agenda item or work session request, but I think it'll take 3 head nods to provide direction to staff. You heard me talk earlier in the urban reserve discussion about removing Goal 5 resources from our comprehensive plans, both the Metro Plan and the Rural Comprehensive Plan. We currently have a staff assignment that planning is working on to amend the Metro Plan relative to special districts for public safety. So it wouldn't be hard maybe to connect that to it, to start looking at that, or talking with the City of Eugene staff about having it connected with the urban reserve issue. Either way, I'd like to see us direct staff to look into, maybe the board assignment is to report back if they have the ability maybe to mix that into those two current processes, to remove those Goal 5 aggregate resources from our comprehensive plans that are no longer an aggregate resource, and make them available for other uses. And particularly, there's a significant lake that could become a city park in North Eugene that has a dearth of parks. That I know there's some interest in turning over from the previous gravel mining operation owners to the city. But unless it's the Goal 5 resources removed and it's brought inside the UGB through the urban reserve process ultimately, or even change in city limits and urban growth boundary, it's still, the initial thing is the Goal 5 resource removal. So if I could.
Who owns the land?
Yeah.
Who owns the land?
I believe it's the All Tuckers, some LLC that they're involved. Yeah, it is. I don't know the exact.
And they don't want to do this, or they do want to do this?
I think they do want to do this. There's been discussions about, and in addition, there's a desire to redevelop the headquarters area that's adjacent to our Public Works Department there. The old, where they used to have their concrete plant and asphalt plant that's no longer in use. I think it's being leased for
Could we
something.
get the LMD to send us an email on
Yeah.
that topic?
That'd be fine, but I think
Yeah.
I can't ask them to do that by
No, I think,
myself, so I'm
I
asking.
think, I would be in favor of asking them to do that.
Thank you. So I see 3 head nods, so.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, I think that's a good thing to ask them about. All right, I wanted to bring up this homeless emergency declaration, the pros and cons of it. Now, I kind of modified that because I heard I would be interested in it, but I'm not necessarily for it. So I'm going to backtrack and say I'm not necessarily for it either, but I definitely would like to see the board take a look at several of these emergency declarations to see if that resulted in any policy change or anything other than them saying, look, we passed this. I'm not interested in passing it if it doesn't have any effect, but I am interested in knowing whether any of these have had an effect. And that's the way I would phrase that request for a work session where our folks that are knowledgeable about homelessness and policy issues connected to it, whether they see any benefit or not in the declaration. Does this waive any state law, any federal law? Does it give us additional rights to grants? Does it, we heard today, one of the city staffers said, well, as you know, there's a crisis in Eugene. Well, I don't know, did Eugene pass a ordinance saying it was a crisis? So that's what I mean. Does it give us anything of value down the road? So I would just pose that as I would like to have a work session on that. Okay. All right, I see 3 affirmative. Any other requests? Commissioner Farr.
Thanks. And you'll find that there's been consideration of that already once we do start looking at it as the board. A couple of months ago now, I talked about kindness, and the city of Eugene has a resolution declaring the city of Eugene a kindness city. I've been sent a request, and I forwarded this to each board member from the Spreading Kindness campaign. It's a Lane County-based organization promoting kindness in schools, businesses, neighborhoods, faith communities, etc. And they would like to, and I would like to encourage that we have a work session on kindness. They have a format that they could forward to us. The mayor of Anaheim, California, ran on a kindness platform and talking about does it spur or change policies or direction or receive aid from outside sources? You asked that question, Commissioner Sorensen, regarding an emergency declaration. Well, the kindness declaration does. It has been very beneficial for the city of Anaheim, and it's also had a noted effect on the way people treat each other. You've probably driven around town. If you drive particularly around South Eugene, you see a lot of choose kindness lawn signs. That is the Support Kindness campaign. So I'd like to request that the agenda team look at a work session on kindness.
I'm for kindness.
I think we should legislate it.
Are you, yeah, I think our libertarian friends would like us to require a kindness of allegiance test, and if they fail, they're going to have their hand cut off. No. Commissioner, who presents the kindness presentation? I mean, what would you envision happening at this presentation?
Tom English is involved.
Tom English is involved. Bruce Abel is involved. In fact, Bruce Abel is the main driving force behind it. And I would expect that he would make a 10 to 15-minute presentation to the board and respond to questions and see if there's any action that could be taken from there. A quote is, Lane County is already an incredibly kind and generous community. We believe that there will be tangible benefits to the county by becoming a county of kindness.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner.
I will just remind Commissioner Farr of how I earned a reputation when I first came on this board about not doing resolutions.
Yes, I remember that. I was sitting out there when you,
Yeah.
you did that.
I support kindness. It's a great idea. But every time we do resolutions for the sake of doing resolutions, we take up staff time and our time, which are both valuable and are limited. We're in the middle of our budget season now, and we're talking about how we had to do trade-offs to, add money for potential interns and drawing from reserves and eliminating positions. And just want to remind you, every time we jump into one of these sort of, it feels good, but we are costing staff time and resources every time we do it. And I just want to remind folks of that. I actually vote against a resolution on school lunches for Food for Lane County to make a point of how much that resolution actually cost the county. And it was somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 just to run the resolution through the system.
And I'm not adverse to your opinion. Don't disagree with you on the fruitless resolutions that really mean nothing, but there are tangible results, particularly from the city of Anaheim, that could be a part of the presentation that would actually demonstrate a return on the investment.
Okay, anything further on the request? Okay. All right. So,
I think we did, yeah.
yep, okay. Thank you. Is there anything further in terms of agenda team requests or work session requests?
There is a song in the Broadway show Camelot called "Fie on Kindness."
It's funny, I was thinking of all these songs that had kindness in it as you were talking.
Anaheim, California is the happiest place on earth.
I'll find that out in a month. So.
Okay, I believe we are done. We've had a review of assignments. There's no executive session, is there, Mr. Mokryski?
Not today, there is tomorrow.
There is tomorrow, pretty big one tomorrow. So I just see no other business. So at this time, I'd like the board to call to my attention if there's any other business today. If not, then I will be prepared to adjourn the meeting. So at this time, is there anything further from any commissioners? Okay, so at this, no. Okay, so at this time, we are adjourned. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. upstairs.